Chapter 673. Right after the New Year, Sandro silently left the Northlands as well. We discussed many things and came to many agreements that weren't even on paper. It could be said that we had a great time together. During this process, we both reached a tacit agreement to forget about a certain undead emperor who had gone missing. I would never release conservation. Avoiding a deadlock in a negotiation that was destined to be impossible to reach an agreement was a type of technique. According to our agreement, within 2 months, a group of high-level undead would enter the Northlands under the banner of the Shilua Empire. They would bring with them large amounts of resources, as well as teaching materials that would help train the first human undead mages. As for me, Sandro was indeed a generous trade partner. He wasn't stingy at all when it came to teaching juniors. Both Harlois and I benefited greatly from him. Of course, as a trade, we also paid a certain amount of our research result. Normalization of magic, from a certain standpoint, the reason why undead emperors were so dangerous was because their research results had already surpassed the limits of the creator goddesses. Many seemingly unremarkable things could also be incredibly dangerous as long as one studied them deeply enough. Actually, in the real world, where you would die if you were beheaded, this wasn't a video game world where you wouldn't die as long as you didn't run out of health. Discussing combat strength and level would be a joke. As long as you could pierce an enemy's vitals, a rusted dagger would be no different from a forbidden spell. Sandro's research direction began with the normalization of divine arts, buffs, debuffs, and other enchantments. He first researched why some spells could be effective for a long time, while others would only be effective for an instant. Then, he moved on to how to make a short-term explosive spell be effective for a long time. This was like turning something rotten into something magical. It seemed quite difficult to understand. Then, let's give an example. For example, if I made a fireball into a buff spell, the existence that was buffed would constantly explode with flames, burning everything like the sun, transforming a life form into an energy form, and then into a magical form. That's inconceivable. As for how he accomplished this, he didn't explain it. I believed that it was impossible to explain it either, just like how I was unable to explain how I created the 7 original sins with word. Ignoring the process and only talking about the result, the final result was that he gave up his physical body and turned into magic. His entire body was a spell, ultimate withering. The withering spell was a 7th circle necromancy spell. It was not very powerful, but it was extremely destructive to living beings. The principle of the spell was to extract all the water in a certain environment and make them wither and die. The spell was very destructive to living beings, but not to the undead. Of course, with Sandro's power, he could also turn bones into powder. The undead would not be able to withstand it. As for Sandro's physical body, beneath his decaying body, there was a withering spell that was becoming more and more intense. This spell was perpetually evolving. Previously, the fairies had said that Sandro had instantly cast out a forbidden spell, but in reality, he had simply removed his disguise and transformed into a withering spell that could cover the entire plains, forcibly blocking the enemy's forbidden spell and greatly injuring the ordinary warriors. In the undead world, this wasn't any big secret. As long as Sandro had attacked before, it would naturally spread. This was also the reason why he was nicknamed the Wither and Lord of Withering. This was also how Sandro had broken through the limits of an undead's natural physical body and soul to become an undead emperor. He had already transformed into magic. What else could possibly restrict him? From a certain standpoint, he was no longer an undead. In fact, it could even be said that he didn't belong to any species at all. I had long since learned this information from Aso. This was also why I said that Sandro was more dangerous than 10 conservation combined. Other forbidden spell mages would have various restrictions when using forbidden spells. Casting a forbidden spell would cause them to enter a long period of decline. However, Sandro was able to instantly transform into a forbidden spell without any restrictions. If he really gave up on everything and started to destroy the living, that would be an unstoppable calamity. The price to pay was that Sandro, who had transformed into magic, was no longer able to use normal undead magic. However, this restriction was incomparable to the destructive power of his forbidden spell transformation. Sandro was a strategic weapon of destruction. He didn't attack, but the moment he attacked, he would furiously create no man's land and change the entire world's map. It should be mentioned that any area that was swept over by Sandro's map attack would be destroyed. The soil, plants, and animals would all be destroyed. The soil would lose all moisture and turn into deserts. The undead would also be reduced to bone dust within Sandro's domain. Neither enemy nor ally would be able to survive. Sandro would obtain an entire undead plane. This was a power that could only be used for destruction. Sandro was unable to create anything, but he could destroy everything. Sandro didn't have any so-called myth-ranked weapons. Or, to put it another way, he himself was a myth-ranked weapon. Not only that, Sandro himself was a form of magic. That meant that apart from dispelling that frightening forbidden spell, there was no way to destroy it. Sandro was an eternal existence that no one would be able to deal with. The other undead emperors were also quite dangerous. However, from Asso's memories, he unhesitatingly viewed Sandro as the most dangerous existence of all. Even in the immemorial divine wars, no god had been able to make Sandro submit. This was why I had previously said that just obtaining Sandro's combat strength would be more than enough. Even in a divine war, Sandro would still be an excellent card. Perhaps Sandro wouldn't be able to destroy a main god by himself. However, he would be able to destroy everything that a main god possessed, while the main gods would be unable to kill him. Actually, main gods were only an evaluation to begin with. They were existences capable of easily suppressing powerful gods. An ancient existence like Sandro had long since been forgotten by history. There was no main god's evaluation of him at all. However, not a single main god would say that they could easily defeat Sandro. But judging from his defeats in the immemorial divine wars, Sandro also had a natural enemy. And his natural enemy was in his enemy's faction. This was why Sandro didn't dare to do as he pleased. Let's not talk about this for now. Sandro generously gave us many of his research results. Many of these results were far too advanced for me, so I needed more time to absorb them. Harloise, on the other hand, benefited greatly as she communicated with Sandro. In return, I also gave him a new discovery. Although it was only a low-level, first circle magic spell, in a way, this discovery could change the entire world of undead magic. Mana Bone Creation, a first circle undead magic spell. It would consume a certain amount of mana to create some bones that could be used to cast undead magic. Alright then, some people could probably tell that this wasn't my invention at all. It was Undead Emperor Conservation's personal discovery. At the time, I forced her to her limits, making it so that she didn't have any resources to create new cannon fodder. She forcefully created something from nothing, using her endless mana to create an undead giant as her trump card in the final battle. In the end, after she was defeated, the results of her research naturally fell into my hands. Not only that, I complained about how wasteful she was. This was a spell with the potential to change the world, yet she used it as her personal trump card. That was far too wasteful. Cultivating undead magic required resources. Corpses and flesh weren't something that could just be obtained by the wind. Although it was now quite easy to obtain corpses due to the many years of war, these were still the accumulation of resources from the past. As more and more undead magic cultivators appeared, there would naturally be more and more tomb robbers. At that time, many problems would arise. Not to mention, the promotion of undead magic was no longer something that only undead mages could do. The development of new magical engineering technology brought about great developments with each passing day. No matter how the technology developed, it was only natural that the more spellcasters were the source of magic, the better. Compared to other types of magic cultivation, the cost of cultivating undead magic was low, and the requirement for talent was low. Even if an undead acolyte didn't have the ability or talent to become an official mage, just selling magic and selling zombie labor would be enough to support themselves. Actually, portable death mana batteries were becoming more and more popular in the market due to their low price. Making all mages, even if it was just undead magic, would obviously improve the entire magical engineering civilization. However, the problem of resources had been brought up multiple times by others. Magical bone creation was essentially no different from using magic to create ice or earth. Both involved the conversion of magic and the element. I felt that the successful research on bone creation was directly related to the fact that the power of death had become one of the 4 major elemental powers. Otherwise, the previous undead mages wouldn't have missed out on such an important technology. For conservation, who lived in the ice plane, and for an undead emperor who was already at the top of the undead plane, such an accidental invention probably wouldn't mean much to her. After all, she could easily summon countless undead as cannon fodder. However, this was an incredibly important foundation for the entire undead magic system. This, as expected of the only undead ruler in the past 3,000 years. Amazing, truly amazing. Sandro was rather frightening when he opened his eyes. However, his words were filled with genuine joy. I felt rather embarrassed, but I wouldn't tell him that conservation was the one who invented the undead Emperor Carwins. That would also bring up a topic that we had intentionally ignored, the missing undead emperor. Conservation had now become Yongya City's limitless mana source. With her as the core, an undead magical engineering factory was currently being constructed. This was a core project that was directly related to my personal power development. How could I possibly stop? Ahem, let's not talk about such things. At the very least, Sandro had left with a satisfied expression. We had also obtained quite a lot of benefits. Harlois was now one step closer to becoming an undead emperor. I also had many new ideas about the magic sword that represented death. Old antique Harlois was quite knowledgeable. Since we were all working together, he wouldn't be stingy. All of our questions were answered. His experience and knowledge, that had been tested by the passage of time, had greatly benefited us. At our current level, it was already quite rare for someone to be able to point us in the right direction. If we accidentally took the wrong path, it was possible that we wouldn't be able to return for several years, several decades, or even several centuries. As conservation's knowledge system was gradually revealed, and Aso's knowledge system was unlocked, a tremendous amount of undead knowledge was being accumulated for me. Harlois, Aso, Conservation, Sandro, and myself, all 5 undead emperors' knowledge systems were placed before me. It was likely that my power system would become unbalanced. My knowledge in other areas would be far inferior to that of undead magic. But if I had something to eat, would I really spit it out? Getting back to the main topic, I felt like I could do something now that all the undead secrets were placed before me. Perhaps I would be able to give everyone a fright. You should first obtain a myth-ranked weapon and become a semi-god. The 4 magic swords are quite ambitious, but none of them have matured yet. Be careful not to meet a powerful enemy that will directly kill you. Also, I can't wait any longer. Isn't it because it's too difficult? You can't wait any longer? Do you think you can break through? Have you found a method to break through? Harlois' words surprised me for a moment, but then I was delighted. A magical pet's power level couldn't possibly surpass its master's. Since she felt like she couldn't wait any longer and felt like it was time to break through, that would be a tremendous difference in power level. I can give it a try. I'm about 50 to 60% confident in breaking through. Also, thanks for your contribution. I was rather astonished by Harlowe's words. Other breakthroughs could be accomplished by taking medicine or studying secret techniques, but undead emperors were the equivalent of breaking through the limits of the creator goddesses. They would be creating their own path. How could they possibly rely on external help? With so many undead emperors' paths before me, not counting the amount of knowledge I've accumulated, this half-living, half-dead body of mine has indeed been a great help to me. For once, the silly cat wasn't acting all tsundere. She seemed to be sighing. Now that she mentioned it, going back and forth between life and death several times was indeed very helpful in understanding the power of death. All right, I'll try to break through as quickly as possible. At the very least, I'm quite satisfied with my ice magic sword's progress. The back of my building was now filled with all sorts of ice sculptures and snow sketches. These weren't materials for my ice magic sword. Rather, they were tools that I used to deepen my impression and memories of the Northland. As an extension of the ice traveler, I would likely need to recall many past memories and calamities in order to create my ice magic sword in the Northland. But sometimes, when you recalled past misfortunes and calamities, and thought how wonderful your current life was, a new calamity would arrive. After the new year, all the administrative departments resumed their operations after a short rest. However, the news that arrived wasn't all good. How could the Northland's natural calamities not mention the beast stampede that would arrive every year? The winter hunt squad was ambushed by a beast stampede? How were the losses? Sandro's visit caused me to put down all the trivial matters on my hands. I also handed over the winter hunt to Renee and the others. What made me feel sad was that Kelly didn't let me off the hook. She still deducted my allowance like she said before. Cough, cough. I never expected that the Mist Kingdom would actually suffer losses during the winter hunt even with their current military strength. The beast stampede was much smaller than expected. We didn't suffer many losses. However, Her Highness Renee felt that something was wrong with the situation. This is a letter she personally wrote to you. The messenger left after handing me the letter. I carefully read the letter. Renee's words were quite simple and direct. There was indeed something wrong with the beast stampede. The beast stampede was less than 1/3 of the expected size, yet it unhesitatingly attacked the human army. Beasts were intelligent as well. They would go around the fully armed iron army in search of weak prey to fill their stomachs, such as attacking villages. That was why, as long as the beasts had an obvious advantage in numbers, they probably wouldn't actively attack the human army. But now, not only did the beasts attack, they even ran away. Not only that, they didn't run fast enough. They didn't even enter deep into the mountains. This scene caused both Renee and I to think of guerrilla warfare and kiting tactic. It was obvious that we were trying to stall for time. I couldn't help but think of those twisted noodle demons. They were definitely behind this, but just what was their goal? Were they hoping that the Beast Stampede would be able to threaten the Northland's Mist Alliance? The Beast Stampede's numbers had decreased, but I didn't think that was a good thing. Droll had long since come to the conclusion that due to the elemental tide's increase, a large number of wild beasts would transform into magical beasts, and magical beasts would become even more difficult to deal with in the Beast Stampede. Not only would magical beasts have stronger reproductive abilities, their strength and appetite would also increase, which would make these magical beasts hungry enough to hunt for food. Their numbers should have greatly increased. Renee's prediction? She had made her prediction based on last year's Beast Stampede's numbers. Meanwhile, my prediction for the Beast Stampede was at least twice as many as last year's. That meant that more than 80% of the Beast Stampede had disappeared, while the remaining Beast Stampede was trying to stall the Mist Kingdom's winter hunting teams. Who would believe that there was no scheme behind this? Just where did the Beast Stampede go? Where else could it go? If it's not in the Mist Kingdom, it's naturally in another country. The other countries in the Northlands will have some fun to watch. Harlois, don't be so direct. Didn't you notice that I was intentionally ignoring this possibility? If your dog bites someone else's dog, you'll have to take responsibility for it. Can't you just deny it? It's not like this is the first time you've done something like this. Good idea. I'll immediately reply to Renee. Elven Empress Harloise has a suggestion. Silly cat, don't bite me on the head. Do you still want to be an undead emperor or not? Chapter 674. As the Bardi Empire's most loyal ally, even though we're far away in the Northlands, we're still concerned about the Bardi Empire's war situation. We've heard that the Bardi Empire's war situation is quite unfavorable. The withered lands on the battlefield are truly astonishing, and the evil undead have been arrogant for the entire world. As the most presumptuous of us all, we've taken a series of actions in hopes that we can communicate with the Bardi Empire and come to an understanding with Sandro. This was a long and stinky letter filled with boring diplomatic phrases. When translated, it was quite simple. I've heard that the Bardi Empire was badly beaten up by the undead. Haha, how embarrassing! But as an ally, I've privately communicated with the Bardi Empire's ace, and he agreed to go easy on us. How do you intend to thank me? When considering that this letter to Bardi Emperor Halent Milan would likely be used as an official record in the future, and it might even be used as evidence to prove Sandro's innocence, such a simple and direct private letter would seem far too rude. Just using such a roundabout way of saying things would take more than 10 pages of paper, and more than 10 times the amount of time and effort needed to explain something clearly on a single piece of paper. However, I knew that such an effort was necessary and worthwhile. How sly. You were clearly the one who wanted to make peace with the undead, but now you're writing this as if you're the one who convinced Sandro to betray the undead emperor's allied armies and join the living for the sake of Bardi's interests. Judging from the results, it's one thing. But this way, I won't be the one begging them, but they'll be begging me instead. They'll be the ones who owe me a favor. This was just like when two countries were at war. One side's secret weapon was so powerful that the other side couldn't do anything about it, and a third party intervened and said that they could help deal with the other side's secret weapon. And if they really succeeded, this would be a tremendous amount of assistance from the Bardi Empire, and the third party would owe them quite a bit. And if I intervened using this as a critical point, I would be able to clear Sandro's name. A defeated war butcher would only be thrown into prison. However, a butcher who realized his mistakes on the battlefield would be able to make others choose to forget his past for the sake of the future. This would actually become a legend. The two undead emperors are delighted to meet, and they forget their grudges with a single smile. They forsake the darkness for the light and reunite. Perhaps this will even become a classic story in the future. Although this sounded ridiculous, it was highly likely that this would happen. At the very least, from the Bardi Empire's perspective, I was the kind-hearted person who helped them eliminate the threat of a forbidden spell. At any rate, I was the only one who knew what really happened. Can you be more shameless? Yes, I can be twice as shameless. So, in order to show my shamelessness, I picked up a pen and paper without hesitation and started to write another letter. My dear comrades in the Truth Symposium, as an honorary member of the Truth Symposium, I've heard that the Truth Symposium has met with difficulties in the war against Bardi. As an undead and ice dual magic mage, I have some personal connections with the death mage Sandro. Perhaps I can help out. Of course, an equal exchange is a basic rule in the magical world. What was even more shameless than buying back both houses was selling two houses at the same time. I believed that with all this in mind, as long as Sandro showed that he wasn't working hard at all, no matter if it was the powerful Bardi Empire or the Archmages, they would all give me a satisfactory return. This wasn't just for myself. It was also to give Sandro a chance to clear his name. Sandro would switch factions first, and the future Tark Republic would be accepted by the world. At the very least, it would sound good to say that he forsook the darkness for the light. After I finished all this, I also needed to give Renee and Gleena an explanation. At the very least, I needed to tell them the results of my secret discussion with Sandro, so that they wouldn't be at a loss. Yep, I definitely wouldn't be explaining why I hadn't participated in the winter hunt. What a joke, would I even need to explain myself to two little girls? You're becoming more and more like an unreliable lazy father who skips off work and then finds an excuse to fool his serious daughter. You can't find an excuse, so you're acting like a parent. Silly cat, I have an interesting bottle of spring water on me. Do you want to try it? What do you want to do with me? No wonder you're not interested in women. So you like cute boys. Actually, it's not that I can't accept such a method, but you'll have to wear female clothing like Princess Peach, which is the most. I was rendered speechless as I looked at the silly cat's embarrassed expression. I directly grabbed her by the neck and tossed her out the window. Go into the snow and calm down. My head was burning up. Our soul connection actually told me that she wasn't joking just now. Just what was going on in this damned elf empress head? Dirty, far too dirty. So dirty that I could write a novel. However, when I mentioned a novel, The Spring of the Drowned Man, I couldn't help but recall Kolos, who I hadn't seen in a long time. Although I had already written her a letter asking her to come, she was far away in Bardi, and it would take quite some time for her to come here. Every time I saw the 2 bottles of spring water in my dimensional storage bag, I instinctively felt that something was off. My many years of experience of being scammed told me that if I didn't hurry up and scam someone else, and use up these 2 bottles of spring water, I would likely be the one in trouble. Unfortunately, the main target, Beifong, was still in the chaos abyss. Judging from his letter, his work was going quite smoothly, and he should be able to return soon. When I thought about the bounty on his head and the fact that he was going to the chaos abyss to avoid calamity, it was understandable that he was hiding, but I don't care if he dies. If he still doesn't come back, I'm going to think of a way to bring him back. I'm going crazy at this rate. The order primates can usually be divided into the more primitive prosimian suborder and the more advanced anthropoid suborder. The prosimian suborder can also be divided into the lemur suborder and the tarantula suborder. My system was becoming more and more confused as more and more strange creatures were about to appear in this world. It kept repeating this animal encyclopedia that I didn't even know where it came from. Spring has arrived. Everything is coming back to life. This is the season of mating. Alright then, I was back in the animal world again. I was almost going crazy after such a long period of time. In fact, I was even beginning to miss the days when I had to make myself scammers, and after constantly repeating this over the past few days, I finally understood what Beifeng's actions represented. From a certain standpoint, all the major species were descendants of the creator goddesses. The gold species titans had given birth to the giants and dwarves. The gold elves had given birth to all sorts of elves. Even the great demons were descendants of the original gold species. Even if there were mixed-blood descendants, they would be descendants of 2 different humanoid species. Not only that, these half-elves and half-beastmen would typically have weaker hereditary abilities. Even if they had descendants, they would usually be descendants of a certain species. For example, a half-elf who was only 3/4 human would actually be a human with pointy ears. And after 2 more generations, there would be no meaning in having a mixed-blood descendant. In the end, the mixed-blood descendants would still be considered part of society. For the goddess of order, the order between species was the foundation of everything. The diversity of species was the foundational foundation of this mystical world. This was also why she had gone insane back in the day, and had intended to give every species a mandate. Every species will have their own responsibilities. The dwarves and giants will be craftsmen, the angels will be government officials and waiters, the elves will be scholars and teachers, the demons will be soldiers and soldiers, the titans will be construction masters, and the dragons will be capable of using their powerful physical bodies and flying abilities as transportation tools for all species, without even mentioning how ridiculous this order was. At the very beginning, this was indeed the perfect society that the creator goddesses of order desired. At the very least, before the dimensional barrier, another universe, invaded and shattered this perfect society, this was indeed a world that both the goddesses of order and order could accept. The result of their defeat was that the goddesses of order and order worked together to seal off the dimensional barrier's dimensional barrier. This caused them to have differing opinions on the path of evolution. The goddess of order persisted in her previous viewpoint and strengthened the roles of order and species. She had them focus on their own responsibilities. Both species and individuals would become the gears of the new generation, strengthening society as a whole. Meanwhile, the goddess of chaos led the demon species on a path of self-evolution. This was something that the goddess of order found unacceptable. However, the only thing she was happy about was that the great majority of species hadn't become as chaotic as the demons. The foundational order of species already existed. But now, not only had this order been shattered, even the most basic purity of species had been destroyed. Not only were the descendants of a certain someone half beast and half human, none of them were unified in terms of species. Not only that, they all inherited the powerful reproductive abilities of their fathers, and were even capable of giving birth to even more miraculous descendants with other species. This might seem like nothing to others, but in the goddess of order's eyes, this was a supernatural phenomenon that would destroy her worldview. Soon, the entire world would be filled with all sorts of strange creatures. The originally unified and harmonious world of all species would be destroyed. At that time, not only would she become an animal encyclopedia, she might even become the mother of all beasts. In the name of the goddess of order, if you don't help me deal with that source of pollution, I'll think of a way to destroy those divine beast mothers. Calm down. At the very least, those divine beast mothers are innocent. Perhaps they aren't that innocent. But those children. Fine, I won't mention those children. A shadow was slowly spinning in the chilly wind. If I wasn't mistaken, this was an ancient nuclear bomb that had already been used up once before. Salo's crystal core. I didn't want to test whether or not my system had the ability to exchange for such a thing. I hurriedly shouted for it to stop, and the shadow returned to nothingness. However, this was no joking matter. Even though it was winter outside, I couldn't help but sweat. This was the first time I had ever seen my system in such a state. For the goddess of order to go crazy like this, a certain someone at the top of the calamity rankings truly lived up to his name. At this point, I was even worried that if that person appeared in front of me, my system would suddenly self-destruct and end everything once and for all. Soon, I no longer had any free time to slack off. The ability to change their appearance? That means that they've already infiltrated the Northland cities. The Warlock's opinion is that this ability to disguise themselves is incredibly powerful. It's highly likely that they've managed to infiltrate the Northlands. Also, judging from their brain dissection, they should have intelligence that surpasses that of ordinary humans. What astonished me was a report that had just been sent to me. This was an autopsy report on the noodle faceless demons that the court had hired. Normally speaking, demons of the same power level would be stronger than other devils. The main reason for this was because demons' abilities were ever-changing. This would be an advantage in individual combat. Meanwhile, devils' power levels were relatively fixed. In fact, they could even choose to advance in power levels in order to obtain certain abilities. They could even create special troops, which would be an obvious advantage in military or special warfare. These weak devils weren't particularly strong in combat. However, they had the ability to corrupt and demonize others, as well as the ability to hypnotize and tame beasts. They were probably special devils that were more inclined towards mental and magical power. And now, the demon warlock's autopsy report mentioned that faceless demons had the ability to change their appearance. Plus, with their mental abilities, they were basically natural-born spies and infiltration troop. In that case, it was highly likely that many such spies had already infiltrated the Northland cities. The combination of the missing beast tide and the spies who were good at infiltrating cities gave people a very uneasy feeling. The only enemy of the Northland city was the beast tide. If these spies disguised themselves as human soldiers, plotted against the city manager, opened the city gates, and let the beast tide enter the city, has the Northland's countries been notified? Not yet. Her Highness Renee is still asking for your opinion. What other opinions do you have? Hurry up and notify the other countries. It seems that the devils want to go big this time. My original evaluation of these devils was quite average. I thought that even if they had the ability to demonize and corrupt others, they would only be low-level cannon fodder in the chaos abyss. But now they had the ability to change their appearance, as well as the knowledge of languages and customs necessary for spies. In that case, their intelligence would definitely be quite high, and they would likely have a certain level of spellcasting ability as well. My original evaluation was wrong. The devil that we captured must have intentionally pretended to have low intelligence. These aren't low-level devils, they're a bunch of high-level devils. They're a bunch of intelligent devils that are inclined towards magic and schemes. A bunch of low-level devils? It was highly likely that they were the personal revenge of a certain devil lord who was displeased with me. Casually tossing out thousands or even tens of thousands of high-level devils, all of which seemed to be single-use products. This was quite a large investment, and of course, such a large investment would be for the sake of a great harvest. Not only did I recall my friendship with the devils, I also considered how I had tricked them in the past. It was quite possible that even a devil lord would personally take action. What's the matter? You're frowning. Yep, I was tricked by your brothers. Brothers! Harloise had just flown back from the window, and there was still some snow on her head. But when she read the report, she recalled those twisted noodle monsters and instantly became furious. Slimes and noodles aren't brothers. Tui, I'm not a slime, I'm an elf. I grabbed the dead cat that was biting me and tossed her onto a nearby wooden table. Stop messing around. I'm getting annoyed. Whenever I think about how something like this managed to sneak into Definder, it's possible that we have these devil spies right next to us. I'm so annoyed. Harloise paused in surprise for a moment upon hearing this, but then she laughed out loud. It's impossible for them to enter Definder. Even if they did, it's impossible for them to be qualified spies. This time, I was the one who didn't dare to believe it. Why? I don't believe that those ordinary city guards would be able to tell a devil from a crowd. Did you forget? Definder is a sinless city, and devils. Can you find a devil that doesn't commit crimes 24 hours a day? Especially when they enter an unfamiliar city penniless. Penniless? I thought about it and realized that this was indeed the case. Devils didn't have the habit of carrying gold coins with them at all times. Their calamity coins couldn't be used in the mortal plane, and while they did have the ability to earn money, their methods of earning money were through theft, scams, and speculation. The great majority of devils that were qualified enough were excellent scammers. If they wanted to do something, they would definitely have a leader who knew the plan. And such a high-level leader naturally wouldn't be outside in the snow. They were most likely already in Definder. Devils also needed to eat, and in order to obtain information, they would need to spend a large amount of money. In that case, when they returned to their old business, a red light would descend, and 2 Justice Knight would immediately appear and be captured. A major spy being captured by the traffic police? That would be such a hilarious scene. Perhaps I can search in Definder prison. The homeless people who committed crimes as soon as they arrived might be the targets we are looking for. Chapter 675. How was one supposed to find demons in a crowd? Toss them into the water. Those that don't drown are demons, and those that drown are humans. How was one supposed to resist the demon's evil witchcraft? Shout out the name of the God of holy light, and demons will be unable to harm devout believers. Our God will not protect believers who aren't devout enough. That sounds nice. Those that die aren't devout enough? It's not like the dead can speak. How was one supposed to kill demons? Toss them into holy fire. Those that die are demons, but those that can't be burned to death. There shouldn't be any demons that can't be burned to death. It doesn't even mention what to do if you meet a demon that can't be burned to death. Also, it doesn't mention how to toss a demon into holy fire. I had a helpless expression as I tossed aside this booklet. The Holy Church's Exorcism Handbook, AD 324 revision, sounded quite reliable, but the methods used in this handbook reminded me of a certain world's medieval witches who tried witches. What the hell is this? The Holy Church has been using this to search for demons for so many years? This is obviously a handbook for murdering the innocent. Actually, this was originally meant for religious propaganda. The demons that were able to hide among humans in the mortal plane were all at least high-level demons. Many of them were projections or incarnations of powerful demons. There were even some cardinals that managed to sneak into the Holy Church. How could any ordinary person possibly find them? That's why the Holy Church sent out a booklet to calm people down? This seemingly barbecued crusader is actually a candle that can calm people down? It really is filled with evil intentions. It would seem that everyone in that world is just as dark. I walked through a long black hallway. Definder's prison district was truly indescribable. Perhaps it was because most of the prison's funds were used to renovate the old and new city district. Or perhaps it was because the crime rate had drastically decreased after Definder's city became a reality. Most of the prisons were unoccupied, and this place still retained its old style. As I walked down the hallway, I couldn't help but cover my nose with the smell of dust. The light from the torches perfectly illuminated the empty prison cells. The empty atmosphere made this prison, which was filled with the smell of blood, seem rather frightening. As I listened to the prison warden's report, I also observed the prisoners. Besides the prison warden's complaints about his work, I also obtained the information that I wanted to know. Only 127 new prisoners had been sent here in the past 2 months, but that was already half a year's worth of prisoners. Even so, it was still strange that there were several times more prison wardens than prisoners. Hearing this, I started to wonder if there was even a need to build a prison. This was a metropolis with a population of several million, but the total number of prisoners was less than 1,000. When any crime would be instantly arrested, the crime rate would actually drop to such a level. Furthermore, most of the criminals were impulsive criminals who committed unplanned crimes. Looks like I've come at the right time. In a few months, I'll be sent to hard labor. Yes. Recently, the number of laborers in the mines and stone factories has been lacking. They have already complained to us many times. However, I heard that they have recently started hiring necromancer apprentices to use zombies and skeletons to open up the mines. For noble lord mages to actually be hired by commoners like us, this era is too inconceivable. The young jailer seemed rather talkative, but what he said was probably what I expected. Unlike a relatively peaceful world where imprisonment was the main form of punishment, the countries of H's world weren't nearly as wealthy. Yes, wealthy. Criminals who committed crimes still had their country pay for them. They didn't have to do manual labor or hard labor, and they could even get some wages to eat and wear. All they had to do was lie down and live. If the countries in the Northlands also used such punishments, it was likely that their prisons would immediately be filled to the brim. Countless people would voluntarily commit crimes just for the sake of a living. Most countries in H's world treated prisoners like criminals who committed crimes such as theft. They would be sentenced to hard labor for a short period of time before being released. This period would normally be no more than 2 years. Most of the time, it would only be a few months. But in order to not make them feel too comfortable, not only would they have to do hard labor every day, but they would also be punished regularly. When they were finally released, they would even have their faces tattooed. This was a mark that would mark them for the rest of their lives, a shame that they would have to wash away with their lives. Yes, this was only a minor crime. After all, this was a chaotic era with many punishments. If it was a major crime like murder, it would be even more straightforward. They would simply be sentenced to death. But in some countries, they would use hard labor, demotion to slaves, or even war cannon fodder in place of the death penalty. But in most cases, those prisoners would have a fate worse than death. Obviously, such punishments were extremely unscientific and inhumane. Some crimes weren't too serious, but they were sentenced to a lifetime of hard labor, which was equivalent to the death penalty. Some crimes were even worse, but they were released after only 2 years of hard labor. However, to the people of this world, such punishments couldn't be any more normal. After all, this was how it had been for thousands of years. However, a certain former judge, who had a bit of obsessive-compulsive disorder, had spent a lot of effort and forcibly created an extremely detailed code of law. From the types of punishments to the number of years and the type of punishment one should receive, everything was stipulated. And with the rise of the Church of Law, this system was also popularized. The punishments became even stricter, which was also more fitting for the prisoners' crimes. The core of this system was probably that they wouldn't feed idlers, but they also wouldn't kill people. Under the premise that the prisoner's life was guaranteed, they would use punishment as a substitute for punishment. They would think of ways to make the prisoner pay for his crimes. They would do their best to reduce physical punishments that would result in crippling or fatal injuries. At the very least, judging from the current situation, it was quite good. The country was saving money, and the prisoner wouldn't die a worthless death. They would also have a chance to turn over a new leaf. They wouldn't have to suffer the shame of having a tattoo on their face, which would make it impossible for them to find a job ever again. It would be quite easy for them to commit crimes again. It could be said that with the interference of a certain transmigrator, especially with the influence of the Church of Law, H's progress in the legal system over the past 100 years was far greater than what he had made in the past several tens of thousands of years. No matter how good the system was, it was unlikely that there would be a situation where there weren't enough prisoners. Not only was the prison empty, the mines that had previously used prisoners as free labor were now in a difficult situation. Of course, I didn't care about all this. It was naturally a good thing that no one was committing crimes. With the rise of undead labor, the labor shortage wasn't actually that difficult to solve. It was already winter, and the open-air heavy labor areas had all stopped working. If I had waited another 2 or 3 months, these prisoners would have started working at the beginning of spring. At that time, they would have been scattered all over the mines and factories, and it would have been too late to find them. It had been less than 2 months since the Demon Abyss's magical reaction had begun. All I needed to do was look for the prisoners that had recently arrived. Rather than using the unreliable method in that little booklet, I had many more direct and effective method. Look, a mystical compass, a devil detector, and the famous Detective Roland's mystical watch, without anesthetic needles. Fine, I'll stop messing around. This is a Contract Heroes bracelet. The Contract Hero system had long since become a popular tool in order to deal with dimensional invasions. Apart from recording the dimensional invaders that the Contract Hero destroyed, it was also capable of guiding the dimensional invaders that had been infected by the net of stars. Of course, the high-power, high-precision radar was also quite large, so it could only be placed in churches and mercenary guilds. The mass-produced bracelet for personal use had limited detection range and precision, so it was more suitable for recording combat results. After the divine power forbidden spell Starry Skies net covered the entire mortal plane, any outsider that entered this plane would be smeared with starlight. The moment that the outsider entered this plane would be the equivalent of exposing their location to the entire plane. This didn't seem like much at all, but it was becoming more and more useful in battle. It was thanks to the existence of Starry Skies Net that we were able to learn about the Demon Abyss's activities and how many lower plane residents had been sent here. Starry Skies Net was a large-scale, perpetual forbidden spell. It had the same advantages and disadvantages as other forbidden spells. The advantage was that it had a large area of effect, and it would be easy to kill the unlucky ones. However, the disadvantage was that it was weak against a single target. Not only that, it could also be defended against. At the time, we had created Starry Skies Net. Apart from encouraging contract heroes to hunt, it was also strategically in order to prevent dimensional invasions. In such a situation, mass-producing anti-detection magical equipment or spending a lot of effort to maintain anti-detection spells on a few individuals would be completely useless. But this time, even though the devils revealed themselves for a brief moment when they first entered, they immediately hid themselves. This doubtlessly meant that they were either super-powerful mages who were capable of cleansing their starlight imprints, or that they were equipped with anti-detection magical equipment. The former was obviously impossible, but the latter, strip all the prisoners. Don't leave even a single sock behind. Then, use this bracelet to test them one by one. I refuse to believe that they'll be able to escape. Chapter 676. In a way, we were lucky. At the very least, we learned of the demon's scheme beforehand, and we managed to find a spy among the unfortunate foreign prisoners. But in a way, we were also unlucky. That was because from the very start, we were the ones who brought trouble upon ourselves. This time, the devil's target wasn't even us. Or, more accurately speaking, we weren't the only target. Elemental war? What a joke at such a time. We managed to find 32 faceless demons among the more than 100 prisoners. This time, we also learned of their official rank and title among the devils. High-level devil Sosolian demons. In the devil language, it meant a devil with a face formed from illusions, illusion face demons. They were a special troop type that the devils had prepared for this holy war. They were trump cards for infiltration and espionage. They had only been born less than 5 years ago. Illusion face demons had so many special abilities that they were quite high-ranked among the devils. At the very least, they were middle-ranked devils who had evolved from middle-ranked devils. Naturally, only the strongest of the devils would be able to send out so many high-level devils at once and even prepare anti-reconnaissance magical equipment for them, a devil lord. As for which devil lord it was, the high-level devil before us wouldn't know. Devils were skilled at scheming and deceiving. Their society was filled with constant internal strife, and their orders were passed down one level at a time. The lower levels could only obey. If they acted too actively or foolishly, they would all die. The true mastermind behind the scenes wouldn't give out such a grand order until the very last moment. However, the devils had already given out a preliminary order, so they naturally knew some things. At the very least, they knew who their target was. The fire elemental lords are trying to attack the ice plane? They're asking you to provide a bridge? Isn't there something wrong with this version? Shouldn't the elemental war have long since ended? I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. I had originally thought that the devils were here to cause trouble for the Mist Alliance, or at the very least, to take revenge on me. But it turned out that the devils were completely unrelated. But from the description of that unlucky fellow, the sequence of events was very clear. Elemental war was a natural trait of the elements. Ever since the creation of the world, wind and earth would forever fight against each other. Fire and water would never mix. Neither side's planes would ever be destroyed, and their battles would never end. Following the formation of the Hades plane, the 4 great elemental planes gradually took shape. The first to take shape was naturally the Great Snow Mountain Magical Realm's ice plane. The rise of a new elemental plane was only natural in our eyes. However, The elemental lords and elemental lords believed that the unchanging structure of the four elemental planes had been broken. This meant that they would soon encounter new enemies and competitors. This was especially true for the fire elemental plane. Previously, when the four ancient elemental gods were resurrected, the fire elemental god was the only one who didn't successfully resurrect. Hence, when the three elemental gods and the fire elemental plane were in full swing, the fire elemental plane was abnormally calm. This calmness was obviously abnormal. The fire elemental plane had always been the most explosive of all elemental creatures. They had good relationships with demons and devils. In fact, the higher-ups of the fire elemental plane were even blood-related. There were quite a few half-elemental, half-hellish magical beasts. There were several famous Chaos Lords who were also fire elemental lord. Even the fire sea Marchioness Eliza, the strongest inferno demon lord of corruption, had a fire elemental bloodline. If one only looked at the overall power level of the fire elemental plane, the fire elemental plane with the strongest combat strength would be second to none in the elemental plane. As the Holy War arrived, the fire elemental lord's power levels increased explosively as the elemental tide increased. The number of fire elemental lords fighting for the position of fire elemental god was now in the triple digit. Battles were fought every day in the mortal plane, and the fire elemental plane's internal strife had never stopped. Originally, the fire elemental lords had been able to maintain a relaxed attitude when faced with a new elemental plane. They had focused their attention on their internal strife, but soon they discovered to their astonishment that the fire elemental tide's growth rate had greatly decreased. They were no longer able to tolerate this. Since the four new elemental planes had been established, this meant that the two mortal planes and the 8 major elemental planes, which were connected to each other, had been rebalanced. Naturally, the elemental tide's power levels would be redistributed. In this period of turmoil, the elements would be reshuffled. Naturally, there would be winners and losers. It was obvious that the fire elemental plane, which had 2 opposing elements, had mysteriously become the biggest losers. Through investigation, the fire elemental lords easily discovered that the fire elemental plane and ice elemental plane were natural enemies. The concept of high temperature and low temperature was even more direct and obvious than the original concept of fire and water. And so, the fire elemental lords mysteriously gained a new mortal enemy whose elements countered each other. And when they learned that the Pillar of Water's master was the former water elemental goddess, the fire elemental lords took revenge on both new and old grudges. Practical benefits and past grudges were all mixed together. It was understandable what the fire elemental lords would do. Originally, wind, earth, water, and fire were natural enemies. Actually, they were all fighting over the elemental tide's resources and territory. Now that a new elemental species had appeared, a species that was likely to be their natural enemy, the Fire Lords instantly found a new enemy as they already intended to do something in the Holy War. But there was a problem. The ice elemental plane was still sealed off, which meant that it hadn't become an independent elemental plane yet. In that case, the Fire Elemental Lords didn't have any way to have fun with this new elemental plane, which didn't have a long enough history. And then, the devils came looking for them. The Fire Elemental Lords only did some side work and preliminary work, yet they were able to see chaos everywhere. Their enemies would suffer and they would benefit. This was the typical style of the devils. They're using someone else to do their dirty work again. Should I say that as expected of the devils? But you seem to have forgotten something. For example, where is the current beast wave? Also, why does the Fire Elemental Lords feel that the cold Northlands is a suitable battlefield? The Fire Elemental Lords were no idiot. Even if they had a tremendous grudge against the Fire Elemental Lords and endless benefits, wouldn't it be suicidal to fight a battle where there was no chance of victory? It was needless to say how cold the Northlands was. From a certain standpoint, The Northlands was the home ground of the ice elemental lords. In fact, for quite a long period of time, most ice elemental creatures in the entire world would live here. Even if this was a new elemental plane, the fire elemental lords wouldn't be so foolish as to start an elemental war in their home ground. Do you really think that I'll know? We devils. The noodle demon was still maintaining its human form in front of me. Although the blonde elf girl with huge breasts looked quite attractive, and the records showed that she was actually a prostitute, I felt my stomach ache when I thought about her true appearance and androgynous body. I also felt a mysterious sense of sympathy for the unlucky fire elemental lord who got dragged into this mess. Perhaps I should record her true appearance and show it to that unlucky fire elemental lord. He'll probably vomit quite a bit. As for the noodle demon saying that he didn't know? With my understanding of devils, this was completely in line with how devil society worked. Low-level devils were nothing more than pawns and cannon fodder for their superiors. Pawns that knew too much would eventually have their own ideas, but I pressed my right arm against the noodle demon's neck and used just a little bit of force, causing the noodle demon's soft and slender neck to completely twist. After a flash of twisting light, the noodle demon's soft neck transformed into an even more slender noodle. You believe a devil's words? Do you think I'm an idiot? I'll just directly ask your soul. I didn't even try to hide the fact that I used a soul-searching undead magic in front of a group of faceless devils. Black smoke gathered on my arm as I guided the noodle demon's screaming soul with my finger. Countless information flashed through my eyes, and soon, the power of death drained the noodle demon's soul of all shards. I selectively started browsing through its memories, but then I slowly shook my head. When I looked at the other devils, they actually began to tremble in fear. Oh my, this noodle demon actually didn't lie. It really doesn't know anything. Alright, it's your turn now? Don't be afraid, it won't hurt. Yep, since you don't even have bones or nerves, there's no way for you to feel pain. A cool breeze blew by as ice began to cover the floor of the cell. Frostbite appeared on the devils' bodies. What made them cower the most was probably the black shadow of death behind me. The undead emperors had no intentions of hiding their evil intentions. I did my best to smile as peacefully as I could in order to enjoy what was about to happen next. However, all I received were hysterical screams of fear. It was truly rare to see devils who were viewed as nightmares by mortals actually afraid of death. Oh my, aren't you all unafraid of death? Killing me will only allow me to be reborn in the lower planes. Isn't that what you always say when you're bluffing? It would be quite difficult for the residents of the lower planes to completely die in the mortal plane. It would be quite common for souls to return to the lower planes to be reborn after their physical bodies were destroyed. However, this type of undying nature was incredibly weak against me. Extracting their souls would be the equivalent of using a road roller to crush their souls into shards. Being reborn into the Guiming River would no longer have any connection to the original noodle demon. All of their paths of retreat would be cut off, and all of their accumulations would be returned to nothingness. This was probably the most pitiful way for a devil to die. Wait a moment, I'll tell you, their begging words came to an abrupt halt. Their confused expressions transformed into nothingness as their dissipating souls were guided by me. That's right, I had no intention of listening to the devils perform their art of lying. At any rate, it wouldn't be wrong at all for the devils to first kill themselves and then interrogate them. My frozen feet prevented them from escaping. It was precisely because I knew how talented devils were at lying and acting that I didn't intend to give them a chance to perform at all. The devils in despair exploded in their desperation. All sorts of spells and curses allowed me to witness the true combat strength of these unique devils. However, in front of a serious devil, these spells were nothing more than a small firework display. After a single flash, there was nothing left. How weak! Even a low-level Irewing demon would be better at fighting than you. Their soft bodies made it impossible for them to use any martial arts. Their magic was more inclined towards darkness and witchcraft, but their power levels weren't high. The only thing worth mentioning was that they actually had a rather strong soul ability. Not only would they be useless against me, even the Justice Knight or Anti-Knight with a firm mind would be useless against them. However, they would be powerful hypnotizers that would be impossible to resist against ordinary humans. Not only that, they also had certain abilities to read minds and memories. These devils were evidently a special type of soldier specialized in infiltration. Their direct combat strength was quite low, but their ability to infiltrate and destroy was incredibly disgusting. They could incite riots, create chaos, bribe spies, and disguise themselves as internal members. Just thinking about it gave me a headache. I also saw the item they used to block my starlight net. It was a pitch-black monkey claw necklace. However, even if the necklace was worn, as long as I was within 1 meter of the necklace, I would still be able to detect the necklace. The ability to block the necklace was only average. However, any ordinary person who touched the necklace would mysteriously feel panic and fear. When the necklace was crushed, I could even hear the screams of ape. It seemed that some powerful devil had paid a huge price to mass-produce this cursed item. Large amounts of memories flooded my mind. Many of these devils were old devils that were over 300 or 400 years old. Their memories of stealing, lying, and swindling were all mixed together. It wasn't that these devils weren't strong. In fact, some devils were overly powerful and ambitious, which was why their superiors had forced them to transform into illusionary-faced demons. Far too many memories and knowledge disappeared with the wind. My unrestrained soul was currently returning to the Guiming River. I didn't have the time to organize everything, so I directly ignored everything that had nothing to do with the Northlands. I only checked the most recent and important information. I refused to believe that the devils wouldn't try to find out what their superiors' true intentions were. Finally, a certain name caught my attention. The Shaywin Free Region? The Mixed Blood Free Region? Why are they involved? Chapter 677. The Shaywin Autonomous Region was a nostalgic name. That was where everything had begun. 8 years ago, when I first returned to the Donglan Principality, the entire Northlands was hostile towards me and the Mist Kingdom. The only Northlands that had a somewhat friendly relationship with me was the Shaywin Autonomous Region, which had many mixed-blood descendants and descendants of the people of the Mist. In Shaywin, Donglan reappeared on the stage of history and formed an alliance with the barbarians and autonomous region's domain lords, beginning the revival of the people of the Mist. A tremendous amount of ore was transported from the barbarian tribes' mountains. A large amount of money for food imports came from Shaywin. More than 40% of the ore and magical gems required for magical machinery were produced here. The very first Northland's survival chain was established here. Shaywin was the only warm valley in the entire Northlands. Although it was too small and couldn't produce enough food for an entire country, Amelia and I conducted countless experiments there. Finally, the breeding of cold-resistant crops was completed there, and the entire Northlands had hope of becoming self-sufficient in food. Many mixed-blood descendants of various species lived together there. Shaywin had once been looked down upon by all the other countries. As the entire Northlands became part of the Mist Alliance, as the Donglan Principality's strongest ally, Shaywin's status also rose. Due to Shaywin's unique geographical advantage, Shaywin became one of the wealthiest regions in the Northlands. The people of the Mist hadn't forgotten about Shaywin's closest ally when they were poor. Many policies and benefits were given to Shaywin's small territory. Just a portion of the mining industry would be enough to feed all the residents of the Shaywin Autonomous Region. As cold-resistant plants spread, it would be too much of a waste to use the valley in the middle of the mountains as one of the few warm regions in the Northlands. Now, Shaywin had become the most famous tourist and health resort in the Northlands. Yep, only the heavens would know if a certain person had suggested this. every winter, a grand ceremony would be held here for the Day of Reconciliation. All the royalty and major nobles of the Northlands would bring their families to participate, to spend the winter here. Yep, the ceremony was nominally to celebrate the reconciliation between the Northlands countries and the establishment of the Mist Alliance. However, the ceremony actually consisted of hunting, singing, dancing, and hot springs. The serious festivities usually lasted less than 10 minutes, followed by all sorts of cultural performances and entertainment. And as the entire Northlands entered a peaceful era, every winter in Cheryl wasn't just a holiday for the royal family and the major nobles. It was also an activity to strengthen friendship and alliances. As time passed, the various countries actually had an unspoken rule of conducting diplomacy and business negotiations in Cheryl. First dispel the other party's hostility at the wine table, then deepen their feelings in the hot spring, and then reveal their trump cards at the negotiation table. This is quite a familiar strategy. The Cheryl Autonomous Region was home to many species and mixed bloods to begin with. Cheryl truly had an advantage when it came to tourism. Not only did the shops in the tourist area sell elven handicrafts, beastman totems, special beast bone products, dwarven sculptures, small swords, and so on. Everything that one could possibly imagine could be found here. Even first-timers would only buy imported goods. However, those who were familiar with the Cheryl Autonomous Region would know that these were all locally produced goods. It was also quite common to see mixed blood elves' songs and dances, beastmen's war dances, and so on. Cheryl's culture was also quite diverse. Although it wasn't as authentic as the original, the mixed blood performers made the audience feel much more at ease. As for what romantic things happened afterwards, well, this wasn't the Sinless City, so Womians wouldn't be able to do anything about it. These gray industries, which weren't convenient to talk about, also became a selling point of this tourist city. In the past, the closer it was to winter, the livelier this place would be. After the new year, the most comfortable and warm holiday villas would only be reserved for the royalty of the various countries. But this year, the number of tourists had decreased by a third. The reason? The Holy War had begun. The royalty and leaders of the various countries were incredibly busy. They had to deal with the various countries' internal wars, their own preparations for war, and food supplies. In the first year of the Holy War, stability was the most important thing. A holiday? Perhaps they should wait until next year. Would there be too few tourists if the royalty didn't come? Actually, with so many tourists every winter, how many of them were actually here for vacation? Perhaps the royalty's descendants were only here to relax, which was highly unlikely. However, the nobles were here on a mission to establish a good relationship with the royalty and other powerful nobles and negotiate with them. Even the wealthy merchants weren't able to establish a good relationship with the royalty, so that their children could enter the upper echelons of society. Of course, it was also because of the establishment of the Mist Alliance that the royalty and nobles of the various countries were able to sit together and peacefully establish a good relationship with each other. In the past, when the royalty and nobles were really together, they would have long since fought against each other due to old and new grudges. It was also because of the establishment of the Mist Alliance that the various countries' politicians needed a neutral location to establish a good relationship with each other and do business. This indirectly helped the Cheryl Autonomous Region to rapidly prosper. Of course, this was also related to the Mist Kingdom's royalty taking the lead. As for whether or not a certain person was behind all of this, every year, the Cheryl Autonomous Region would give a certain person a super red packet as thanks. Unfortunately, the red packet would always be kept by the Donlon royalty's chief steward Kelly, just like how an elementary school student would have their New Year's money kept by their parents. This year's situation was rather special. The royalty and nobles of the various countries didn't have the time to waste on idle chatter. The end result was that the top of the Northlands pyramid didn't come, and a large portion of the Northlands pyramid was missing as well. Many tourists, who didn't know the truth, were regretting coming here for nothing. This year, the royalty had only sent about a quarter of the previous year's royalty, while only half of the nobles had come. This meant that the villas and hot springs were mostly empty. This gave Cheryl's domain lord a huge headache, as he had spent so much effort organizing this event. He was probably going to suffer a loss this time. But soon, he wouldn't have to worry about making ends meet this year, because he needed to first think of a way to survive. There's still no news from our reinforcements? Has there been any response to our request for reinforcements? The Cheryl Autonomous Region, which had been peaceful for so long, was actually being threatened. Not only that, it was a group of wild beasts that came out of nowhere. This was something that Cheryl's domain Lord Kakagar couldn't understand. Over the past 8 years, Kakagar's already fat body had become even fatter due to his increasingly wealthy lifestyle and Anton's environment. Back then, people had secretly called him the Frog Prince Kakagar, but now people were calling him the Hippo King Kakagar behind his back. Damn it, where did our guards go? Where's our Cheryl's barbarian elf archers and beastman berserkers? It's time for them to show off their skills, but they're nowhere to be seen. Haven't they finished gathering yet? My apologies, my lord. More than 70% of their warriors have been professional actors and dancers for several years now. Many of them refused our forceful summons. Even those who did respond to our summons need time to find their own weapons and equipment. Ridiculous! Our warriors have become clowns. This is a serious case of corruption. I'm going to have a good discussion with my general. Just which bastard dared to do such a foolish thing? The government official who had given the order remained silent. However, Kakagar didn't dare to make decisions on such a major matter. He still remembered that it was this Hippo King who had pressured the military to make this decision. Kakagar calmed down quite a bit after venting his anger on Kakagar. He wanted to make up for the foolish things he had done back then. Back then, he had thought that the Mist Alliance's rise would be complete, and he would go on a tourist route. With the 2 major Mist Kingdoms acting as his shield, the possibility of a civil war in the Northlands would be nearly zero. Rather than maintaining useless soldiers, it would be better to make more actors and actresses to earn gold coins. The other country's combat strength was several times greater than 8 years ago. The Cheryl Autonomous Region's financial income was 100 times greater than 8 years ago, but its combat strength was less than 1/5 of what it had been 8 years ago. Not only were the nobles and domain lords in a hurry to make money, even the warriors under them were busy making money. The military was living off of their salaries, and the warriors had become merchants and actors. What combat strength would such an army have? From a certain standpoint, the fact that there were no external threats or wars was the poison that would cause a country's defense to collapse. Kakagar was quite anxious as beasts kept roaring outside. Now wasn't the time to blame others. If he didn't think of something soon, he wouldn't have anything else to spend his money on. Kakagar's round eyes kept spinning as he stared blankly at the villa area under the high walls. Although he had been famous for his intelligence in the past, he really did come up with a solution at this moment, even if it was a solution that would cause endless trouble. Tell those foreign nobles that we're no longer able to protect them. Have their bodyguards and mercenaries join the battle. Chapter 678. To save or not to save. This is really a problem. Stop joking around. Of course we have to save him. The foundation of the Mist Alliance's trust is the alliance between allied countries. Do you really think that we can't save him? To be honest, I really don't want to save him. Although the Donlon Principality was talking nonsense, when the Cheryl Autonomous Region's request for help was sent over, the Donlon Principality unhesitatingly gave up on the New Year's work that they were doing normally. They gathered their army and prepared to go to war. The reason why I was chatting and hesitating on whether or not to ask for reinforcements was because of another piece of information. The door to the fireplane. This is clearly a trap. The elemental planes were probably the easiest planes to connect to in the mortal plane. Many mages' mage towers would use elemental pools that connected to other planes. However, those types of small elemental pools could only be used to extract elemental energy from other planes or summon small elemental creatures. Elemental magic also had to follow the most basic elemental laws. All miracles were the result of the accumulation of elemental power. Opening an elemental dimensional door would naturally require an area with an accumulation of elemental energy. Opening an elemental dimensional door in the deep sea, opening an elemental dimensional door in a snowy mountain, opening an elemental dimensional door in a place of thunder and wind, opening an elemental dimensional door in an underground place, or opening an elemental dimensional door in a volcano. The warm valley of Cheryl Autonomous Region had always been viewed as a miracle of nature. It was also the result of the surrounding mountains and terrain. However, no matter how much the wind was weakened by the high mountains, the low temperature in the surroundings would still come. If there was no other reason, there was no other explanation for the valley. With the development of the area, the appearance of geothermal and hot springs proved to the world that there was a volcanic area underground. Yes, it was proof, not discovery. The existence of a volcano here was recorded in the history of the Sharvans, but the Sharvans themselves would never admit it. After all, building a home on a volcano required more than courage, it required more than just helplessness. The half-blood descendants who had been exiled back in the day were already fortunate enough to be able to find a place to settle down. The fact that this land was even able to produce food was a testament to the gods' protection. It was far too extravagant to consider the possibility of a volcano eruption in the future. In the geographical records of other countries, it was indeed mentioned that more than 700 years ago there was once an active volcano there, and that a rather famous red dragon family lived there. Ever since I learned that this incident was related to the fire elemental plane, I had already started searching through old maps of the Northlands for volcanic areas. Since I had obtained the name of this place from the illusion face demons, many things were no longer a secret. Perhaps that place was already a dormant volcano, but for fire elemental lords, awakening a volcano was basically their specialty. Not to mention fire elemental lords, even red dragons and fire archmages had the ability to do so. However, fire elemental creatures were still the strongest in this area. Volcanoes were the most abundant fire elemental creatures in the mortal plane. For example, Immortalorcan had transformed the underground world into a labyrinth, awakening a volcano, and transforming the lava and flames into his own nest. This was a basic ability of fire elemental creatures. In that case, all sorts of information and possible developments were right in front of us. Once Cheryl's warm valley was conquered, the volcano would immediately erupt, and a tremendous number of fire elemental creatures would jump out of the volcano. Considering the current density of the elemental tide, it was quite possible that the fire elemental plane would appear in the surrounding area. The moment that we failed to rescue Roland, it was highly likely that we would be dragged into the conflict. This would be the equivalent of dodging a sea of flames while challenging a powerful elemental god in the elemental plane. Fire elemental creatures would constantly enter the battlefield. Killing them would only be sending them back to their home base. This place would still be their home field. This type of battlefield was the most annoying and powerless. If there were any other possibility, I wouldn't want to face such a bottomless meat grinder at all. Alright, it seems that I have no choice but to go. At a time like this, we need an expert. Eliza? You're thinking of someone else when you need her? How heartless. Of course. Do you think that she's as free as you? Of course I wouldn't bother her for no reason. Forget it, I'll contact her later and hope that I'll be able to make it in time. At the very least, I'll give her some information. Back in the day, Eliza and Adam's small team went to intercept the Demon Wave's dimensional door. According to the plan, after I cast Ice Aeon, they would choose to take refuge in the Chaos Abyss, as well as take care of some other matters. After all, most of them were of the fire element. Based on the fact that fire and ice elements countered each other, being hit by an ice-forbidden spell definitely wouldn't feel good. Forbidden spells didn't differentiate between friend and foe, and there was no mercy to be had. If they were really hit by one of my forbidden spells, even the pure fire element Elisa and Little Red would be heavily injured. If they were unlucky, it was even possible that they would be killed by accident. The end result was still acceptable. Little Red, who was capable of flying at high speeds, caught up to us and told us that we were safe. Little Red herself didn't return to the Chaos Abyss. She was doing her best to eat dusk fruits to increase her age, so that she could recover her combat strength before the next trouble came. For us, traveling to the Chaos Abyss was the equivalent of a vacation. However, as the Dragon Queen of the Underground City, Little Red actually didn't have many vacations, especially since Dragon City was filled with arrogant and aloof individuals. She would have to go back regularly to keep things under control. Actually, Little Red had a capable and qualified substitute for the Dragon Queen, yep, her mother, the former Dragon Queen Molly. However, considering her past deeds, none of us would feel reassured about her. Getting back to the main topic, after the order to mobilize was given, the Donglan army swiftly gathered. However, there was a slight problem. Considering that the mountains were still sealed off by the heavy snow, it was impossible to count on the infantry's movement speed in such a situation. Furthermore, considering that there would be limited escape routes if the volcano erupted, the main army directly gave up on all the heavy and slow infantry types and chose the Winter Hunt Knight. The Winter Hunt Knight wasn't an infantry type. Since the Mist Kingdom's royalty was holding a winter hunt, all the Night Knights from all over the Mist Kingdom had already been gathered. The speed at which the ground forces gathered was quite fast. Also, since the various feudal nobles and domain lords of Donglan were also participating in this winter hunt, there was no lack of noble Night Knights and their personal guards among the urgently gathered warriors. High-level Night Knights and warriors' numbers and quality far surpassed the norm. In just a short half a day, Definder had gathered more than 50,000 elite Night Knight. If we counted the mounts as combat strength, there would be more than 1,000 Night Knights who were at least Master or higher. It could be said that there were several thousand pure legend-ranked Night Knight. When combined, the overall combat strength would be quite impressive. Being able to participate in the winter hunt already proved that their mounts couldn't possibly be ordinary donkeys or horses that would shiver in the winter. There were military iron horses, magical beast mounts, pure-blooded Ice Plains horses with thick black and white fur, and so on. There were all sorts of strange mounts. Together with the various family flags and personal battle flags, as well as the colorful armor and mounts, it gave off a rather mixed feeling. Looking down from the sky, the entire snow-white tundra had been casually sliced apart by this mixed army as if they were cutting a cake. The entire tundra was filled with all sorts of colors. Birds would flee wherever they passed, and beasts would hide. Once they started moving as a group, the Night Knights' auras would be quite astonishing. However, the situation in the sky wasn't so great. Only the new Borealis seemed to be slowly advancing. There were only a few medium-sized airships escorting it, which was far inferior to the Elven battle. The originally powerful Borealis airship had just been disbanded, and the airship escorting the Elven caravan was still on its way. It would take quite a while to reorganize and repair the Elven caravan. Only the royal airship stationed in Definder could be mobilized in time. When considering the upcoming battle, aerial superiority would be incredibly important. Since the new Borealis had just finished a long journey and battle, it was in poor condition. The only fortunate thing was that Definder was the Aurora Night Legion's headquarters. When the Mist Kingdom's royalty called out to us, the Aurora Night Legion followed us as usual. We had brought 2 squadrons of 200 Aurora Night Legion with us. This was more than enough to deal with any aerial battle at the national level. We had also temporarily hired 6 black dragons and 4 red dragons, which would be a powerful assistance. Unlike other enemies, beast stampedes were also part of the food chain. Dragons were at the top of the food chain, and they could use their draconic might and dragon roars to suppress and disperse small beast stampede. And if we had to fight against fire elemental creatures, red dragons with incredibly high fire resistance and black dragons with full magic resistance would be the most suitable aerial forces. The only regrettable part was that these dragons were still only young or middle-aged dragons. It was impossible to hire immemorial dragons or higher. Little Red's reputation still needed to be improved. That's why I came along. A black-haired girl was munching on a disgusting fruit. During the past 2 weeks, the masked dragon queen had become quite famous for robbing people of justice points. Yep, that's right. The masked dragon queen's figure and draconic might were far too easy to recognize. However, the victims didn't dare to complain to the dragon queen. Not to mention, there weren't many robbers per person, so the matter could only be left unsettled. Actually, I personally felt that the dragons were already used to robbing each other. She was currently sitting by a window and enjoying the snowy scenery. However, I was becoming more and more curious. Shouldn't she be running back to Dragon City and being annoyed by countless tasks? I was indeed quite happy that Little Red had appeared in time, but I felt like something was off. Don't tell me that you felt like you couldn't finish all those tasks, so you just gave up and ran away. Why aren't you saying anything? Hey, you didn't really sneak out, did you? You're the Dragon Queen, the boss of Dragon City, the ruler of the underground. Can you stop acting like a naughty brat who skipped school because she didn't finish her summer homework? Aren't you the same? You're so weak already. Can you even fight right now? If we're going to make the best use of everything, you should be in the backlands dealing with government tasks. Right, I can be your bodyguard. Yep, I'm your bodyguard right now. Remember to pay me by the day. I felt rather helpless as I looked at the Dragon Queen who was spouting nonsense and acting shamelessly. However, when I considered the fact that a super red dragon like her would have an obvious advantage against fire elemental creatures, I indeed didn't intend to send her back. Fine, do whatever you want. But don't even think about hiring me. Still, if your luck is too bad, your red dragons will indeed receive the best hiring fees. Little Red had an expression of astonishment. She was just saying it casually. Could it be that she would really be able to obtain any benefits from this rescue battle? Volcanoes. If volcanoes really do appear, wouldn't your red dragons be able to migrate here en masse? Why did the silly cat bite me? Cough, cough. I was just making an analogy, I didn't mean it for real. Renee will definitely win. Behind me, Renee and the others were glaring at me with displeased expressions. If volcanoes really did appear, that would be the same as announcing the destruction of the Cheryl Autonomous Region. It would seem that I had indeed jinxed such a thing in front of a battlefield. But from a certain standpoint, I wasn't making things up. Red dragons were fire element dragons, so they liked heat and feared cold. Many red dragons weren't used to living in the Northlands, and volcanoes were the red dragon's favorite nest. If volcanoes really did appear, I could even directly build a new dragon city. Perhaps I would even be able to summon a few powerful ancient red dragons as mercenaries. I was just joking. Why are you glaring at me? Do you still remember the success rate of your jinxed mouth? If I recall correctly, it's 100%. It would seem that the Cheryl Autonomous Region is truly doomed. Every debt has a debtor. Everything is Roland's fault. Tui, silly cat, don't speak nonsense. You're ruining my reputation. Now that I'm predicting that we'll be ambushed by enemies, does that really mean, report? We've encountered a large beast horde. General Reed is asking for a plan. Should we go around them or attack? Roland! I understand. From now on, I'll shut up. Actually, you can't blame me, right? The devils are all watching us. Report! There's a chaotic reaction in the sky to the southwest. Judging from the magical radar, it should be a high-level devil in aerial combat. Today's weather is really nice. I'm going to take an afternoon nap. Remember to wake me up after the battle. Chapter 679. War seemed to be the only theme in human history that couldn't be eliminated. And as the era changed, the main forces and combat methods of war would always change. In the ancient divine wars, although both sides would have incredibly high levels of power, not only would they use their power in simple and crude ways, most of the existences on both sides would fight barehanded on the battlefield. The most direct way to describe how the divine wars fought was with punches and kicks. After the eternal holy war became the main theme of this era, as the warring species constantly changed, the methods of war would also constantly change. Infantry, spear throwers, shield warriors, mages, curses, chariots, cavalry charges, and the age of cold weapons and magic caused the main forces of war to constantly change as well. During peacetime, the changes in the various species wouldn't be obvious. The main forces on the battlefield would still be the same. The only amazing thing would be that their steel armor would be thicker, and their weapons would be improved so that archers' shooting range would be increased by another 10%. But during the Holy War, all sorts of new weapons would appear, directly changing the quantity to the quality. The main forces that were supposed to be the country's strongest weapons one day would be proven useless by the cruel battlefield the next day, and would be immediately eliminated or thrown into the second line. The tremendous changes on the battlefield would make people feel that all the previous battles were nothing more than fake matches. During the World War, there would be changes every year. New troop types, new combat methods, and new strategies would be introduced. Falling behind would mean getting beaten up. When all the chips, no matter if they were resources or intelligence, were thrown into the cradle of war, and when thousands of years of accumulation were forcefully converted into combat strength, anything was possible. And now, the Holy War had officially broken out. Magical engineering technology had greatly developed and changed many things. There were countless highlights, with new troop types and equipment attracting countless gazes. However, the most obvious difference between the Holy War and the Holy War in the olden days, and the brightest among all the stars, was the widespread and commoner use of aerial units. In the past, only a single human kingdom would be able to raise a single Griffin squadron. Small and medium-sized countries that could raise aerial knights would be incredibly wealthy. However, these precious aerial knights wouldn't be used on the battlefield to kill enemies. When considering how precious they were and the cost of maintaining them, even if the price was 100, they would still feel like it was a loss. In that era, these precious empty knights were often carried by the sons of nobles. Their main job was to investigate and act as messengers. At most, they could suppress the enemy to a certain extent under absolutely safe circumstances. They could be considered a type of scout unit. Even if he really wanted the Griffin Knight to attack the ground, how could he expect the aerial knight to shoot the crossbow from the sky? That pitiful accuracy and range would be worse than spitting on the ground. At the very least, it would disgust the enemy and damage their morale. At the very least, in the Yongle era, the expensive aerial knight was either a guard of honor or a scout. It was impossible for the bone dragons to find a decent opponent in the sky. Back when the Mist Kingdom was still around, the Aurora Knight was a top-level military unit that shook the entire world. And now, only a dozen or so years had passed. Barty's Dragon Knight Squadron, which had expanded by at least 10 times, was now a familiar sight to everyone. Everyone was already used to the airships and airships flying overhead. If anyone still viewed the Dragon Knight Squadron as nothing more than a decoration, they would obviously be behind the times. Donglan's magical engineering technology is the best in the entire world. The Mist Kingdom's technology is the best in the world. I ignored this great engineer who said something so subtle. At the very least, they had completed the mission I had given them. Our scout airships had never stopped patrolling. Our scouts had already discovered the enemy beast's tracks before they could even see the enemy beast. And even if the scouts' aerial knights made a mistake, our large magical radar had already locked onto the illusion-faced devil's amulets with the assistance of our engineers. Yes, the enemy beasts could use their monkey claw amulets to block out the enemy's tracking. But now that we had a sample of the amulets, those amulets actually became tracking devices. It was quite easy for us to use magical radar and mage detection magic items to find the enemy beast's location. The scout's memory ball transformed into an illusory scene that allowed us to see the enemy beast's battlefield. The enemy beast's battlefield was a flat road between valleys. It seemed wide, but there were tall mountains on both sides. This road was also a slightly higher mountain road. The rugged terrain forced the night knights to slow down. As long as the enemy beasts blocked the path in front of them and suddenly attacked from both sides of the mountain, it would indeed be possible to completely wipe out all the night knights gathered together. Our radar also discovered the illusion-faced devil's tracks from both sides of the mountain, which allowed us to indirectly piece together the enemy beast's attack plan. Spread out, Sunban. I mean the Phoenix airships and Aurora Knight. Little Red, stop slacking off. Have your dragons cooperate with us. The Borealis hovered in midair as its cabin doors slowly opened. More than 40 Gnome Phoenix airships and nearly 100 Aurora Knight airships swarmed out. The dragons that were protecting the airship also began moving out. Another order had been given. All the Night Knights on the ground were to stay where they were. The upcoming battle would have nothing to do with ground troop. 8 years ago, in a country war, if a dragon appeared on one side, even if it was a young dragon that hadn't even grown a single wing, the enemy's morale would probably collapse. But now, it would be strange if more than a dozen dragons didn't appear on that battlefield. Dragons are basically the most common troop type. On the radar, the dragon head symbol representing the dragons was slowly glowing. For red dragons were flying rather quickly and had already reached the very front of the group. Red dragons were experts in aerial combat, as well as the vanguard of ambushes. Their dragon breath flames that swept across the ground were classic and practical. The warlike red dragons also used their actions to express their desire for battle. Of course, they also desired gold coins. The payment for hiring dragons was directly related to their combat result. Young dragons would naturally desire a carpet of gold coins in their nests, as that would be the prerequisite for them to obtain the love of a female dragon. How were they supposed to get married if they didn't have a marriage room? Young male dragons actually had the same problem as humans. Meanwhile, the 6 black dragon heads flew much slower. They were quite scattered and guarded the sides in front of the group, faintly acting as guards for the weak Phoenix airships in the middle of the group. This wasn't a coincidence. Rather, it was a tactical arrangement that we had made for the Phoenix airship. Black dragons' flying and aerial combat abilities couldn't compare to red dragons. Their melee combat abilities were only slightly stronger than the shame of dragons, the white dragons. Their corrosive dragon breath had a limited range, and its effects were slow. However, they were still viewed as a powerful dragon species. The only reason for that was because their species' natural talents were far too powerful. Of course, true magic immunity. Black dragons were immune to magic. Of course, it was impossible for anyone to truly be immune to magic. Black dragons' magic immunity was only said to be frightening. Actually, black dragons' natural talents were quite similar to the dark elves' natural talent. They simply had a powerful magic resistance. However, when facing off against novice human mages, this was no different from being immune to magic. The older a black dragon was, the stronger their magic resistance would be. Although we had only hired young and middle-aged dragons, they were still immune to all magic spells below the 7th circle, and would greatly reduce the damage of all magic spells below the 9th circle. Their task was quite simple. They were to protect other aerial units and act as meat shields when necessary. Heavy crossbows, instant cast spells, and magic scrolls were the main weapons of aerial combat. Since speed was the most important aspect of aerial combat, these young black dragons wouldn't have too many magic circles. These young black dragons could barely be described as an impregnable flying fortress against ordinary mages and aerial combat mages. When they arrived, just the dragon's might of the crimson dragon that seeped out immediately attracted the opponent's attention. In the midst of the chaos, the aerial units in the beast wave began to fight. However, the red dragon's dragon breath arrived first. The dragon's might, which was at the top of the food chain, was fatal to the beast wave. In front of the dragons, the low-level flying magical beasts could only tremble. They didn't even dare to fly up and fight back. Meanwhile, the magic vultures, thunder rocks, wyverns, manticores, and other mid-level and high-level magical beasts that were barely able to fly weren't greeted by the angry roars of the dragons. Instead, they were greeted by the Aurora Knight's assault. Countless ice shards flew everywhere. In the instant that the magical beast's vision became hazy, the Aurora Knight's ice dragon spears viciously stabbed into the flying magical beasts' bodies. The exploding ice magic stole the victim's life force and body temperature. This was the Aurora Knight's most commonly used aerial combat combo. In just a single exchange, the powerful mid-level and high-level magical beasts all fell to the ground like dumplings. Using the Aurora Knight in the past was actually a mistake. Rather than using them on land attacks, it would be better to make use of their advantages as instant-cast ice magic and aerial heavy armor units, allowing them to have a tremendous advantage in aerial combat. Unlike the aerial magical beasts that relied on their instincts to fight, the Aurora Knight, who were already used to battle tactics, always maintained a formation of several riders. They maintained the advantage of having more than one rider in a small area. When they encountered top-level magical beasts that were difficult to deal with, they would directly go around them and let the thick-skinned dragons deal with them. During battle tactics, using the dragons in the same team as meat shields to avoid attacks was a very important tactical point. As aerial combat units, the dragons were also thick-skinned enough to ignore ordinary arrows and magic. This was the most shameless part about them. At this moment, around each dragon, there were 2 teams of 8 to 10 Aurora Knight flying around. This was a basic aerial combat unit. The Aurora Knights' cooperation with each other was also quite skilled. They created large Yoi blizzards to affect their opponents, created ice armor and ice walls to defend against their opponents' attacks, suddenly attacked from the sides or behind the dragons, and ambushed them. A single team of Aurora Knights charged forward, and magical beasts constantly fell to the ground. The sky was completely cleared. It was quite obvious that in the Red Dragon team, the Red Dragons were the vanguard and would charge forward. Meanwhile, the Black Dragons were much slower. The Black Dragons were mostly used as meat shields for the aerial Knight. This was a battle of tactics and instincts. Perhaps it could also be said that it was a one-sided battle. The magical beasts that were only relying on their instincts to fight were completely stunned. Faced with an unstoppable opponent, the beast's survival instincts swiftly gained the upper hand amidst the dragon's roars, draconic might, and pitiful screams of their own. No matter how the illusion-faced demons urged them, a large number of aerial magical beasts began to desert, even though they outnumbered their opponents by more than 10 times. At this moment, the fragile Phoenix aircrafts finally arrived on the battlefield after their aerial dominance was guaranteed. They began their work. This time, their mission was exactly the same as the previous demon wave. Numerous bottles and barrels of magical potions were tossed down. The improved special potions were even more effective than the previous demon wave. Soon, the beasts began to riot due to the effects of hormones and special potions. This was the foundational difference between the two sides when it came to combat, as well as the difference between intelligent creatures and wild beasts. Targeted potions, advanced combat tools, and combat methods would determine the victor from the very start. The improved potions were very effective. The wild beasts' ferocity and reproductive instincts were stimulated, and the only targets they could vent on were their own kind. the entire beast horde became a sea of infighting. Once the aerial dominance was secured, the Aurora Knight and Dragons began their next round of aerial attacks. However, they discovered that the damage they were causing was far inferior to the beast horde that was self-harming due to the potions. Thus, they focused on protecting the aircrafts, replenishing their ammunition, and continuing to scatter potions. The Phoenix aircrafts replenished their potions 4 or 5 times before the ambushers were almost completely wiped out. Even though it was winter, the smell of blood still wafted through the air. Corpses of magical beasts could be seen everywhere. It was likely that we wouldn't even be able to find the remnants of illusion-faced demons in the chaotic mountains. After the illusion-faced demon died, the beast horde began to flee in all directions due to the threat of the dragons and powerful enemies. We had obtained victory, and our own losses were negligible. However, I was unable to feel happy at all. We wasted an entire afternoon, and even used up more than half of our special potions. Those bastards don't know how to treasure their ammunition at all. The most troublesome part is that the enemy managed to predict our path of reinforcements. In that case, they definitely have a backup plan. Chapter 680. The name Cheryl Autonomous Region explained many things. It wasn't a country. It was merely a self-managed territory. In fact, for quite a long period of time, Cheryl had been isolated from the diplomatic circle of the entire Northlands. In this fantasy world that was dominated by feudalism, human domain lords and nobles were a type of status, as well as a type of bloodline responsibility. Of course, it was also a type of power. In Aichi, which had nothing to do with peace, nobles had a series of enviable privileges. For example, as long as they surrendered in time, they would be able to keep their lives, and as long as they paid a sufficient amount of ransom, they would be able to return home with relative dignity. Of course, this was only limited to internal conflicts between humans. This was also why human nobles would fight to the death whenever they encountered a foreign war. It would be either you or I who died on the battlefield, and internal conflicts wouldn't be as intense. Another privilege that people envied was that only nobles could become domain lords. This was an unspoken rule that made people feel helpless. However, most people took it for granted. There were very few methods for commoners to become nobles. The most reliable method was to use brute force to develop uncultivated land. Even if one succeeded in developing a new territory, such a knight would be viewed as inferior by others. At the very least, it would be impossible for such a knight to enter the circle of major nobles for at least 3 or 4 generations. Such a relatively closed concept of social class existed in every country. Nobles in every country would marry each other, which deepened the circle culture. Even if a country was destroyed, local domain lords and nobles would still exist, which greatly weakened royal authority. There would often be situations where the royal family would still fight to the death against a powerful enemy, while the nobles would surrender to the enemy because they had a better bargaining chip. Noble heraldry only studied the history, family emblems, bloodline inheritance, benefits of nobility, and inheritance rights of nobles. It was now a specialized subject that would take several years just to study. From a certain standpoint, it was quite boring, it was a type of culture. As for Cheryl Autonomous Region, even though it couldn't be called an independent country, the domain Lord Habel family was actually recognized by the Northland's noble circles. This was because Kakagar Habel's bloodline originated from the Mist Kingdom, and he had once been a local noble of the Mist Kingdom. Things like history and ancestors' honor were not worth mentioning when you met someone who didn't acknowledge you, but if you threw it into the circle of nobles who talked about ancestors' honor every day, it would be a big deal. Unlike the relatively stable central regions of Ike, the Northland's nobles didn't have a long history. The map of the various countries kept changing, and a family with a history of 300 or 400 years was already considered quite old. As for the Haber family that originated from the Mist Kingdom, they weren't recognized when the people of the Mist were in decline. But when the people of the Mist rose again in power in the Northlands, the Haber family instantly got a free ride. That was why, even though he was just a feudal lord of an autonomous region, cunning fox Cockagalal dared to shout at the counts and marquises of various countries. With the advantage of being a landlord and his past reputation, the feudal lords of various countries really obeyed his orders and sent out their own bodyguards and mercenaries. After all, this wasn't a civil war between human kingdoms. Once the defense line was broken, the hungry beasts wouldn't spare your life just because you had a noble bloodline. On the contrary, the tender skin and fat bodies of noble children who lived like princes were even more delicious. Damn it, just where did these beast waves come from? The mercenaries clearly drove away all the beast hordes on the map. Faced with the endless beast hordes, Cheryl's autonomous region had already given up on all of its outer defense lines. The outer cities were all conquered, and the villagers who didn't manage to evacuate in time had no chance of surviving. In front of the beast hordes, the formerly famous Cheryl guards and mercenaries performed quite poorly. Their organization was in chaos and they lacked manpower. The long-term lack of training meant that they didn't even have enough weapons and equipment. They lost their lives for nothing, and there were even deserters who appeared under the threat of the beast. Cheryl's autonomous region used its own misfortune to teach all the Northland's domain lords present a lesson. Even if they were in a period of internal peace, they still couldn't hand over their own sword to others. There were over 20,000 professional soldiers, but less than 4,000 of them could actually participate in battle. Meanwhile, the temporary mercenaries and bodyguards that were gathered here, and there were easily 10,000 strong squadrons. This was actually quite normal. In this day and age, with the threat of beast hordes in the wild, it was quite normal for a domain lord to bring over 100 mercenaries and bodyguards with him. Several hundred nobles easily gathered an armed force of over 10,000 people. Not only that, they were all personal guards, professional bodyguards, mage consultants, and so on. Cheryl's combat strength seemed to be even stronger than the regular army. Those who only brought 1 or 2 bodyguards and dared to wander around the entire Northlands were even better. After all, that only meant that a single powerful individual's power level was comparable to over 100 professional warriors. The nobler a person's status was, the stronger their ability to disguise themselves would be. Cheryl's autonomous region currently had many members of the royal family and major nobles. Rather than temporarily mobilizing and organizing commoners to act as a defense line, it would be better to find these people to save their lives. Gagger lived up to his reputation as a sly fox. He managed to find a way out of a desperate situation. His own reputation and relationship with the Mist Kingdom also made his summons effective. Now, it was all thanks to the mercenaries and bodyguards that the domain lords brought over. With the advantage of the city walls, they managed to create a temporary defense line that successfully blocked the beast horde. However, nobody knew how long they could last against the endless beast hordes in the wild. The only thing they could hope for was that reinforcements would arrive as soon as possible. The Eagle tribe? They should be the closest reinforcement. The barbarian tribe that was allied with the Cheryl Autonomous Region lived in a mountainous region not far from Cheryl. They were the most likely reinforcements to arrive. However, only Gagger himself knew that he couldn't count on his trustworthy barbarian allies. They've made a lot of money selling ores these past few years. Who would still want to live in the mountains and suffer from the cold? Most of their members have moved to the big cities to enjoy life. There are only a few miners left in the mountains. From a certain standpoint, what the barbarians would do after earning money was indeed worth discussing. Perhaps some people would think that the barbarians would use their money to improve or repair their own villages. However, the barbarians of the Eagle tribe gave the most direct answer. They would take their money to the cities and become rich. Since they'd already become rich, why would they still stay in the mountains bare-chested? The nearby barbarian elves and beastmen tribes? They should still have enough combat strength, right? Let's pay them to help us at all costs. There were quite a few mixed bloods among the residents of the Cheryl Autonomous Region. However, those who lived in the city were mostly mixed bloods who had accepted human culture. The mixed blood tribes that worshipped the beastman's totemic culture and the elves' mountain lifestyle were also scattered outside the city of the Cheryl Autonomous Region. The mixed blood tribes maintained a seemingly distant relationship with the Cheryl Autonomous Region. They often traveled down the mountains to the city to purchase daily necessities. However, they always refused to assimilate into human culture. Their combat strength was outstanding. If it had been 8 years ago, it would have been a good idea to ask for reinforcements from them since they were of the same origin. However, right now Gagger was filled with regret. He regretted that he had acted so quickly and so viciously. There are still primitive barbarian tribes in this world. Our tourism plan has opened up all of those tribes to the public as tourist attractions. All sorts of bandit strongholds and tribal streets are well received by tourists. Those barbaric mixed-blood warriors. They couldn't have all been killed? Or exiled? The guard leader had an astonished expression. As the leader's personal guard, he had never heard of such a thing before. Could it be that there had been a secret bloody massacre? Is this something from that generation? In this day and age, who would still do such a thing? Rather than fighting and killing, it would be better to get rich together. They took a large amount of compensation for their relocation. Those who wanted to live with the elves could directly go to the kingdom of the elves to buy houses and residences. After all, the Mist Alliance had the support of the elves, so they weren't afraid of being bullied. Those who wanted to experience real Beastman life could directly take the compensation and go to the Beastman Plains. I just received a letter from them a few months ago. They're living like emperors. Even the mixed blood can spend money to buy a tribe leader. Even I'm envious of their simple lives. From a certain standpoint, the Cheryl Autonomous Region had also risen in power. The result of every inch of land around it being worth its weight in gold was that everyone was only interested in money. All the potential reinforcements had been developed and opened up to the outside world. All that was left were merchants who wanted to get rich together with everyone else. Hoping for merchants to fight on the battlefield? That would be blatant murder. Perhaps Gagger wasn't the best leader in the Northlands, but he was still a publicly acknowledged talent in the Northlands, an outstanding business genius. But now, he had an expression of helplessness and regret. I can only hope that the Mist Kingdom catches up. Their fleet should be able to make it in time. No, for the sake of my future gold coins, they must make it in time. Chapter 681. Considering the great distance between the Mist Kingdom and the Cheryl Autonomous Region, I had already expected this scene when Donglan's reinforcements were ambushed multiple times by beasts. What a spectacular sight! In the distance, there was a volcano erupting into the sky. A large amount of gas and volcanic debris were mixed together, forming a thick layer of gray smoke. Amidst the smoke and dust that filled the sky, the core of the volcano lit up with flames. Lava slowly flowed from the surroundings, and the high temperature began to burn the entire land. The powerful eruption sent volcanic debris all the way to the stratosphere. The sky was filled with suffocating volcanic ash and floating rock. Even though we were far away, we could still feel the great power of nature. No matter what was in between, it probably couldn't survive. Cheryl Autonomous Region is finished. Along the way, we met with more than 10 interceptions. However, the total number of ambushes we encountered wasn't as many as the first time. There were also a few flying magical beasts wandering around. It was obvious that they were there to slow us down. If that was the case, we should have been able to reach the volcano last night. The volcano shouldn't have been activated yet. However, those devils had taken advantage of the snowy mountains terrain to create several avalanches and blow up 2 bridges, forcing us to take a detour and slow down. This was a typical devil tactic. Not only would they do anything to achieve their goals, they wouldn't even give us a chance to fight them head-on. When our reinforcements were repeatedly delayed, we were already prepared for the worst. In the end, we saw a volcano erupt right before our eyes. Kakagar, on this day next year, I'll be sure to visit your grave. The volcano really did erupt. Roland Crowbeak, how do you feel? Ding. You have obtained the title Roland Jinx. After equipping it, you can use long-range causality attacks, but it is only limited to specific attacks, such as I think it's fine as long as it doesn't catch fire, or this volcano will definitely not erupt. I helplessly stared at the sky. This definitely wasn't because of my foul mouth. This was obviously the enemy's plan. From the very start, we were a step slower than them, allowing them to successfully carry out their plan. How could I be blamed for my foul mouth? Kakagar, rest in peace. Although you've been making a bit too much money over the past few years, I'll take revenge for you even if it's for the sake of the Mist Kingdom's remnant species. Kakagalal isn't dead. Our people have already found him. Although he's in a sorry state, he's in good spirit. I wanted to say a few words to lighten the mood, but I was interrupted in the middle of my speech. I couldn't believe the terrifying scene of the end of the world in the distance. How did they survive? Originally, they were all waiting to die, but last night, the beast tide voluntarily opened up a path, and someone even shouted for them to be let go. In the end, all of them really walked out after one night. I was stunned. You can do that? Wait, does that mean that the beast tide made way for them? No, does that mean that if they had continued to stand their ground, they could have held on until we arrived? Calculating the time, that's indeed the case. It seems like this is also the reason why the opponent allowed them to escape. I was rendered speechless. It would seem that our traveling day and night had been effective. At the very least, the beast stampede and the illusion-faced devil behind the scenes were afraid of our arrival, which allowed the Shaywin people to escape. Based on my understanding of Gagalal, he would unhesitatingly grab onto this life-saving straw to escape, even if he could faintly guess that reinforcements were about to arrive. Forget it. Since things have come to this, it's better to be alive than dead. How is that fat fox? He hasn't taken things too hard just because he went bankrupt overnight, has he? The attendant's expression became rather strange. Finally, he gave me the answer that I wanted to hear. He hasn't. The first thing he said when he met us scouts was, "Goddess of wealth, it seems that I'll have to change my business to volcano tourism in the future. I hope that I'll be able to earn back what I lost while I'm still alive." He's actually thinking about making money? The moment I said this, everyone around me started laughing, which finally lightened up the atmosphere. I shook my head and sighed. 8 years ago, when I first met Gagalal, he was still a far-sighted leader and tactician. Now, after only a few years of doing business, he had completely transformed into a merchant. But no matter what, it was a good thing that Gagalal was fine. Now, some of us were even taking off our thick winter clothes. It would seem that this year's weather was truly going to change drastically. Perhaps it really would be possible to start a tourism business. Wag! At this moment, the angry roars of ferocious beasts in the distance attracted our attention. Our aerial steeds brought back images of gigantic fire beasts walking out of the volcano. Countless middle-sized and small-sized fire elementals were also jumping out of the nearby lava. It would seem that the fire elemental plane's dimensional door had opened as planned. We were in for some fun. Let's first construct a defensive line. Tisk, it's so hard to relax. We had already sent out orders to rescue the refugees. Due to certain reasons, the Mist Kingdom's warriors were quite experienced in disaster relief. The sudden arrival of our reinforcements obviously gave the mastermind behind the scenes a lot of pressure. They gave up on their plan to surround and annihilate Cheryl. Although the Cheryl Free State region was finished, the loss of population was still acceptable. When the Berserk fire elementals arrived from another plane, the first to fight them weren't the humans from the mortal plane. Instead, it was the beast wave that was still lingering here. The moment that the volcano erupted, the Northland's beasts that were naturally afraid of fire broke free from their control. If the illusion-faced devils hadn't escaped in time, they would likely have become snacks for their own subordinates. The remaining beasts were chased by the fire elementals and finally fell into a desperate situation. It would seem that we wouldn't need to worry about next year's beast wave. From a certain standpoint, these beasts had become sacrifices for the opening of the dimensional door under the devil's control. As the Northland's combat strength increased, beast waves were becoming less and less of a problem. As long as one could find a way to deal with these irrational beasts, it wouldn't be difficult to deal with them. Regular armies didn't need to fear the beasts. If it wasn't for the fact that the Cheryl Free State region had been in such a terrible state over the past few years, it would have been possible for them to deal with the beast wave. However, a beast wave was one thing, while an elemental invasion was another. The former consisted of irrational and unorganized beasts, while the latter consisted of an army led by an elemental lord. Try one. Stop joking around. I don't have such an ability in my current state. Besides, even if I really try one, it might not be of any use. As I looked at the volcano before me, I regretfully gave up on using a forbidden spell. It would be quite tempting to use an Ice Aeon spell while the devils were still unstable and would be able to earn countless points. Unfortunately, in my current state, not to mention a forbidden spell, I couldn't even cast an ice magic spell above the 5th circle. And even if the devils were foolish enough to make me chant a forbidden spell for several days, it would be meaningless to simply extinguish the flames before me. The dimensional door leading to the fire elemental plane would definitely be located at the place where the flames were the most intense. Right now, it was likely that the dimensional door was at the bottom of the volcano. Even if I used a forbidden spell to extinguish the flames, that would only be a temporary solution. Just like during the demon wave, as long as I didn't cut off the dimensional door, there would be an endless stream of elemental creatures. This was the most troublesome aspect of the Holy War. Before the Holy War, there would be many restrictions placed on the dimensional door in the mortal plane. Any teleportation would require a high or low price. For example, once a dimensional door was opened, it would be impossible to close it. Teleportation would be as difficult as visiting a neighbor. An ordinary small-scale battle would easily become a meat grinder of a long drawn-out battle. Perhaps this is the devil's goal. They want to borrow the power of the fire elemental plane to stall us. The devil's scheme had already been realized. Some things weren't difficult to guess. In order to overturn the Mist Alliance, which was becoming stronger and stronger, a sufficiently large price would be required. However, the residents of the lower planes were obviously unwilling to fight to the death against the Mist Alliance. However, the devils were most familiar with finding a third party to give the devils some trouble. The flames in the distance were rising higher and higher. The opening of the dimensional door allowed the power of the fire elemental plane to surge in. The rapid increase in temperature indicated a change in the environment. However, the violent fire elementals had no intentions of leaving the volcano. They were also accumulating power in preparation for the upcoming elemental war. It would seem that we need a sufficiently solid line of defense. Renee, summon all the leaders of the Mist Alliance. Don't forget to inform the Great Snow Mountain Magical Realm and the Contract Hero Guild that we need to have a proper discussion. Even if you don't want to make trouble with the Chaos faction, the Chaos faction will make trouble for you. Chapter 682. From a certain standpoint, the volcano eruption was both accidental and inevitable. We had made many preparations in order to deal with the Holy War. The entire Northlands was now united, and the Northlands Alliance, which was difficult to deal with and didn't have many benefits, would only become stronger and stronger as time passed. This sounded excellent, but while you were scheming against others, others would also be scheming against you. Although the Northlands would be difficult to deal with without any benefits, the wise wouldn't choose such a troublesome opponent. The Chaos faction had forcefully found the fire elemental plane, which didn't care about any benefits or losses, and forcefully dragged the Northlands into the battlefield as well. You want to accumulate power by yourself and easily become the final victor? Dream on. The world isn't as easy as you think. The Chaos faction taught us a lesson by teaching us that plans couldn't keep up with changes. In this day and age, nobody was an idiot. But, from a strategic standpoint, this wasn't without any benefit. At the very least, we were now more and more confident in refusing to ask for reinforcements from other countries. I'm truly sorry. We really want to help you as well, but we're also having a difficult time on the battlefield. Your Highness Roland, which plan do you think is the most suitable? Many plans went through my mind, but in the end, nothing came of it. The reason? We were currently in the middle of a meeting of the highest level in the Mist Alliance. Every country had either sent a representative, a king, or a prince. Our small tent was filled to the brim. Even the major domain lords could only stand outside and enjoy the wind. Meanwhile, the people inside the tent couldn't come to an agreement no matter what. It had already been 1 week since the Cheryl Autonomous Region had been destroyed. All sorts of rescue missions had already begun. The Cheryl Autonomous Region didn't have a large population to begin with, so it was quite easy for the Mist Alliance to absorb the population. Kakagar, who should have had some objections, was now completely filled with gold coins. It wasn't that we didn't want to help the Cheryl Autonomous Region reclaim its territory. It was just that there was nothing we could do about the endless volcanoes before us. A new dimensional battlefield had appeared in the Northlands. This was a major event that involved all of the Northlands. It was only natural that we would invite the leaders of every country to come and discuss countermeasures. But what made us feel helpless was that we were still unable to come to an agreement. Those who are closer feel that it's a threat. They want to use the Mist Alliance's power to quickly extinguish the flames. This is understandable, but it's truly impossible. However, some lords believe that it's enough to just isolate the area and increase the temperature of the northern lands. In the long run, it might not be a bad thing. Some major nobles even believed that the Mist Kingdom was too powerful due to its close relationship with the Ice Elemental Plane. Perhaps a new Ice Elemental Plane would be an opportunity for other countries. In fact, some nobles were even secretly trying to contact the Fire Elemental Lord. Everyone proposed their own solutions for the sake of their own benefit. Of course, they wouldn't directly state their own benefit. They would simply use the Great Mist Alliance's name to promote their own ideas. However, it was obvious that none of them would be able to convince the other party with their own opinions, so the conference could only drag on indefinitely. Since the Mist Alliance was an alliance between countries, it was necessary for the Mist Alliance to listen to the other countries' suggestions. There was no point in wasting time like this, and the boring procedures would still have to be completed. But in the end, the biggest member would be the one to make the final decision. Yep, in the end it would be up to Renée herself. Of course, it would be up to me as well. I tossed all the proposals aside. Some people were used to thinking too much. I wouldn't even look at these proposals. Communicate with a Fire Elemental Lord? Do you know the Fire Elemental language? Besides, do you know what the Elemental War represents? That's a mortal grudge. Do you really think that it's possible to stop it now? I didn't tell the entire truth. Actually, it would be possible to communicate with an elemental expert. If I asked the Wind Elemental God or the Earth Elemental God, they might even be able to mediate. However, I didn't believe that it would be a good thing to make peace with the Fire Elemental Plane right now. Water and fire were incompatible. The Ice Elemental Plane and the Fire Elemental Plane would forever be mortal enemies. Since we had chosen the Ice Elemental Plane as our ally, not to mention that Frigid Maw and the people of the Mist had been friends for thousands of years, there was absolutely no need for us to change side. Temperature rise is a good thing? Do you know what it means for all the snow on the Great Snow Mountain and all the glaciers in the North Sea to melt? I hope that by the time the Great Flood arrives, you'll have learned how to swim, or even become frogs. I didn't lie, but I also didn't tell the entire truth. Melting all the ice and snow in one go would transform the entire Northlands into a vast ocean. However, even 10 more fire elemental gods wouldn't be able to accomplish such a feat. Slowly increasing the temperature year by year would have an acceptable effect on the environment, just like how the ice elemental plane was causing the temperature to drop every year. I wouldn't even consider their proposal. In the Mist Alliance's grand plan, ice and low temperatures would be our natural barriers. The ice elemental plane would be our natural ally. Burning our own barriers for warmth before winter passed would be incredibly foolish. I wouldn't explain the specifics to these domain lords and kings, because that would mean countless explanations and negotiations. There would also be endless assumptions and differences in interest. Rather than telling the truth, which would cause a series of problems, I would rather use a true lie to obtain an agreement. After all, this would be far more efficient. The truth wasn't in the hands of just a few. Everyone had their own interests. In the end, they would choose the truth that suited their own interests. The so-called majority was the gathering of various interests. Whether or not my lie would be exposed wasn't important. What was important was that this was the will of the 2 major Mist Kingdoms, which would soon become the will of the entire Mist Alliance. From today onwards, the volcano region where the Cheryl Autonomous Region used to be is now viewed as enemy territory. The Fire Elemental Plane and the Fire Elemental Lords are the mortal enemies of the entire Mist Alliance. According to the Mist Alliance's wartime regulations, any traitors shall be mercilessly executed. Everyone in the tent suddenly fell silent after I said these words in a calm and decisive tone. Some people opened their mouths and exchanged glances, but ultimately didn't say anything. Judging from everyone's expressions of disbelief, the Mist Kingdom's representatives in the past had never been so direct and forceful. That was to be expected. Renee and Glena were both women, and they were far too young. Their administrative methods would definitely be softer, and they would seek to coordinate rather than dictate. As for me, when considering my past reputation, I felt that I was indeed quite suitable for playing the role of a bad cop and dictator. And so, I directly picked up the pile of documents and casually tossed them into the trash can next to the table in front of all the rulers. Since we've all come to an agreement, let's carry it out as soon as possible. Have the Allied military begin preparing to construct a defensive line. Yep, since nobody dared to object to what I said, this meant that we had all come to an agreement. Now that all our plans were useless, let's start from the moment that we treated the Fire Elemental Plane as our mortal enemy and start making new plans to deal with it. How boring. Every time I want to do something, there's always someone causing trouble for me. I can understand that humans are social creatures, and that scheming is almost instinctive. But every time something like this happens, I miss the undead who only know how to listen to orders. Boss words are always correct. It's so simple and direct. I took a deep breath as I gazed at the distant volcano. I stomped my feet and jumped slightly to warm up my body. The arguing in the tent behind me was getting louder and louder, but I didn't intend to pay attention to them. From the very start, I had never intended to listen to their opinions. The Iron Triangle in the Mist Alliance was becoming more and more stable. With the Mist Kingdom, the Underground, and the Shilua Empire all under my control, even if the other countries allied together, they wouldn't be able to do anything. As the Holy War progressed, efficiency would often be the priority in order to better deal with it. If everything needed to be agreed upon and all the allied countries came up with the same plan, then there would be no need to do anything at all. This time, even though this was an emergency meeting to discuss an unexpected situation, it was also a method to give the other allied countries a warning. Only one voice was needed in an unbreakable alliance during a time of war, and this voice could only come from Definder. After I played the bad cop, Renee and Glena would naturally play the good cop and make up for the cracks in the alliance. However, the fact that the Mist Kingdom had the final say in the Mist Alliance was right in front of everyone's eyes. The other allied countries needed to understand their own weight in order to prevent even worse situations from occurring. And while the Mist Alliance's political world seemed peaceful, there were actually endless undercurrents. In that case, it was even more necessary for me to play the bad cop. Is there any news? Marquis Ben and Prince Steele have been quite active recently. Many major nobles are in private contact with them. The news that the Mist Alliance isn't the Mist Alliance of the Mist Kingdom, but the Northlanders was spread by them as well. It's said that they're secretly promoting humanism and excluding other species. They've really attracted quite a few people. The Kasola Kingdom? There'll always be people who can't accept this. Make it clean and don't leave any loose ends. Oh wait, let's leave some loose ends. Make it more obvious and die a more pitiful death, so that everyone can see the consequences of playing tricks at this time. Schemers and ambitious schemers weren't actually wrong. Everyone would always think for themselves. If a politician didn't think for their own country or people's interests, and instead only thought for themselves, that would be nothing more than a despicable politician. Only a first-rate politician who tied their own interests to their country and species' interests. But at this critical juncture, trying to split apart the Mist Alliance to increase their own political power was obviously underestimating our determination to prepare for war. There was no need to continue wasting time. In front of absolute power, the entire Northlands Alliance was becoming more and more stable. These people who couldn't see the situation clearly were nothing more than clowns sent out by the masterminds behind the scenes to test the waters. But if the Mist Kingdom retreated, that would be the equivalent of someone testing their limit. In relationships between countries, patience wasn't a virtue. It was weakness. As long as you showed signs of fatigue, a chain reaction would naturally follow. Since you've all reached out, then I'll just directly chop it off. Chapter 683. When I finally found the time to go see Kakagar, I had many assumptions. Would he break down in sadness because he lost his homeland? Would they think that they were determined to take back everything they owned? Or would he become dispirited and restless because he suffered a severe blow? No matter what, he's probably changed. It's so embarrassing that he fell so quickly in the past few years. However, I never expected that Kakagar would have such an expression when I saw him. Brave adventurers and contract heroes, the evil inferno demons are right in front of you, but are you truly prepared to deal with them? This is the final battle on the front lines of the flames. Don't miss this opportunity. Ice enchantment scrolls, ice potions, and fire-repellent staffs are all top-level equipment meant for dealing with fire creatures. And as the former owner of this place, not only can you obtain free maps from me, I'll even give you a mission. As long as you bring back a soul core or mana resource from an elemental creature, you'll receive my reward. Kakagar wasn't the one shouting with a megaphone, but rather his former secretary. He was currently squatting next to a price list and eating a pancake in an unseemly manner. He was even sweating profusely as he ate. If I didn't know him personally, I would have thought that he was just an ordinary merchant. What was incomprehensible was that he wasn't glaring at the mountain of flames with deep hatred, nor was he depressed or helpless. He was no different from how he was in the past. "Hey, isn't this your Highness Roland? Are you here for a tour or a vacation? If you intend to go explore, I have some good stuff here. I guarantee that the flames won't hurt you, and I'll give you a 40% discount." Kakagar was actually the one who greeted me first. However, my eyebrows kept twitching as I saw this scene before me. If I were a slightly more normal soldier, I would have probably thrown Kakagar into prison already. The reason? Kakagar was currently selling the adventurers all the military resources that had just been given to the human armies. In order to seal off the fire elemental creatures, the surrounding human armies had probably already given out fire-resistant military resources. There was also a seal from the allied armies beside the product. "Where's your army?" A total of 3,000. More than 2,000 died in battle that night, so there's probably 400 or 500 left. They're useless anyway, so they've all been dismissed. Hearing this, I was truly stunned. The next moment, an indescribable anger rose within me. However, Gagalal spoke first. Country. I know that you guys don't recognize Cheryl as a country, but at least it's a territory, right? If the territory is gone, what's the point of having the soldiers guarding it? It's better to let them go back and reunite with their families. It hasn't been easy for them to survive. He seemed to be a little cold. Rubbing his hands together, Gagalal stood up. Although his expression was as calm as ever, I could see the sorrow and hatred in his eyes. Do you regret it? I didn't mean regret, but I knew he would understand. Regret? That's the most meaningless thing of all. That's because my choice back then wasn't wrong. The trade route was perfectly suited for the Cheryl Autonomous Region to begin with, and it's also thanks to this trade route that my citizens' living standards rapidly improve. Our status in the entire Mist Alliance also improved. Gagalal paused for a moment and mysteriously fell silent. He then became even calmer. If I could do it again, I would still choose this trade route. The Cheryl Autonomous Region doesn't have many permanent soldiers to begin with, and we don't have enough population or combat potential. The hybrids aren't even able to keep up with the times. Rather than being on guard against this, we'll miss out on a great opportunity for the Mist Alliance's development. I might as well take a gamble and focus on the trade route. It's just that our luck was a little bad. There just happened to be a volcano right under our feet, and a fire elemental lord even came looking for us. I mysteriously felt guilty as I kept repeating in my mind, it wasn't my fault. It wasn't my jinx. But since we've already enjoyed the benefits of our choice back then, it's only natural for us to pay the price for our choice. What's the point of regretting it? If we have so much free time, we might as well think about the future. I could sense that he was speaking from the bottom of his heart. Perhaps the entire Mist Alliance had underestimated him. Weak countries also had their own methods of survival. Strong countries could be domineering, sly, and unparalleled. They could sow discord and scheme against other countries. However, weak countries would be playing with fire if they dared to do so. Gagalal had seen through the future trend of the Mist Alliance's unification. In front of such a trend, the Mist Kingdom would definitely eliminate any troublemakers. Even if there weren't any troublemakers, the Mist Kingdom would at least find 1 or 2 troublemakers to make an example out of them to establish their authority. Since the unification of the Mist Alliance meant that there would be no internal conflicts, only a cold war, Gagalal appeared to be greedy for peace and had given up on his armaments. However, he was actually using this as a way to remove other countries' guards against him. With the support of 2 major countries, he was able to focus on the service industry and business development. At the same time, he was able to gradually integrate into the Mist Alliance's political circle as a harmless party. The developments over the past few years had proven his choice. 10 years ago, who would remember this Cheryl domain lord? Now, all the other countries' kings would give him sufficient respect. As for the other unnecessary things, Gagalal wasn't in a hurry. He would wait until the Holy War was over. Not having an army also meant that he wouldn't need to send any soldiers to fight in the Holy War. Paying for things like that was completely acceptable, which would actually reduce the pressure on him. After the Holy War was over and the power structure was reshuffled, it might be an opportunity for Cheryl to rise up. At the very least, Cheryl's economy would improve, and his country would naturally become stronger. Cheryl's words wouldn't be any less authoritative. From a small country's perspective, not only was there nothing wrong with such a development path, it was even quite wise and daring. Even if Cheryl's reputation was completely ruined in the process, if he played it well, he might be able to obtain the reputation of being the ruler of a prosperous country in the future. But if he was unlucky, just like what was happening right now, he would be labeled as a foolish domain lord who caused the destruction of his country due to his excessive licentiousness. Not only that, he wouldn't be able to get rid of this reputation even after he died. It was likely that his children would be forever tarnished because of this. Actually, the difference between a foolish ruler and an eternal emperor, between a lunatic and a genius, was sometimes just a tiny bit of luck. The unlucky person who failed would always be wrong no matter how he tried to explain it, while the lucky person who succeeded would only be treated as being humble no matter how much he tried to explain it. Do you want to reclaim this land? I do, but it's unlikely. I also know what an elemental war represents. Besides, the entire Mist Alliance, the Mist Kingdom, and you probably don't want to see the fire being extinguished. In that case, no matter if he's capable of doing it or not, it's impossible to extinguish it. Indeed, the Mist Alliance should be at war, and it would be best if the scale of the war could be controlled. That way, we would have a reason to withdraw from the chaotic battles in the center of the continent. The flames of war in the Northlands would also make the Other Order faction and Chaos faction feel less worried about the Northlands. Perhaps we weren't the ones who started this fire, but looking at it from a long-term perspective, this would indeed be beneficial to the Mist Alliance. I indeed wouldn't allow this fire to be extinguished so easily. Sly Fox smiled honestly, just like a skilled merchant. However, he didn't try to hide the fact that he had already seen through everything. I fell silent. Since Sly Fox was being so direct and sincere, I would seem even more foolish and vulgar if I tried to speak in a bureaucratic manner. Actually, there's no longer any need for the Cheryl Autonomous Region to exist. If any other Cheryl person had said this, I would probably have thought that they were insane. However, Kakagar had finally gotten rid of his playfulness and was saying crazy things with a serious expression. Chauvinism is actually another name for racism. Back in the day, my ancestors gave this region this name in order to remind their descendants that unlucky people like us are actually a group of pitiful people who have been persecuted and exiled by racism. Since other species don't treat us as their own, us mixed bloods are considered a family. No matter if they're half-elves, half-humans, half-beastmen, or half-giants, as long as they're victims of racism or purebloods, they're all our kin. Over the past several centuries, 11 generations of Cheryl Domain Lords have fulfilled their promises, and the situation hasn't changed at all. The entire Northlands are our enemies. They look down on us, view us as enemies, and call us bastards. Pure-blooded humans even treat us like beasts. Apart from the Mist Kingdom and barbarians who are related to us by blood, the entire Northlands views us as lowly outsiders. At this point, Kakagar paused for a moment. The next instant, his murky yellow eyes seemed to glow with a golden light as he became spirited. However, the appearance of the Mist Alliance changed everything. When the entire Mist Alliance began to accept undead, elves, beastmen, dwarves, dark elves, and dragons, under your policy of equal communication and mutual respect, it became much easier for mixed bloods like us, who were born as freaks, to accept us. Your Highness Roland, we mixed bloods are truly grateful to you for this. At the very least, we don't need to wear hoods and capes anymore. We can walk openly in the Northlands without having to worry about being seen as bandits or bastards, or being treated as slaves or prisoners for no reason. After many mixed bloods, Kakagar's physical appearance was basically identical to that of a human's, apart from his pointy ears. However, deep in his heart, he still viewed himself as a mixed blood, as well as the representative of the mixed blood's benefits. Although he seemed slow and foolish, he actually had a sensitive heart. I won't say anything about treating all species equally. As long as the Mist Alliance becomes stronger, all species will be able to live together. Everyone will be a different species, and no one will be a different species. The Cheryl shelter that protects the mixed-blood bastards will indeed no longer have a need to exist. It was at this time that I was tempted to start developing businesses and tourism, At the very least, magical engineering technology made the mixed bloods lose all their advantages in combat. Their weaknesses of having fewer people and being uneducated were quite obvious. In order to not be left behind by time, I needed to find food for the future Cheryl people. Now that Cheryl is gone, it might be a good thing for our mixed bloods to integrate into the Mist Alliance and Mist Kingdom. The Mist Kingdom is such a large country, so we can't mistreat our own people. The old cunning fox patted his butt and stood up, leaving me in the background. I don't need any compensation. As long as the Mist Alliance doesn't fall, and the Mist Kingdom doesn't fall, it'll be enough for us mixed bloods. Right after that, Kakagar's deep voice, which was filled with philosophical thoughts, suddenly became sharp. Everyone passing by, don't miss out on this. The newest top-quality military equipment is on sale. You won't be able to buy anything anywhere else, even if you have money. I risked my life to get my hands on this. Chapter 684. How good or bad a politician was would be judged by the current generation. That was because the moment a politician's reputation hit rock bottom was also the moment a politician's political life came to an end. The result of overly pursuing the common people's interests would be a lack of self-awareness. Most of the time, the opinion that received the majority vote wasn't the truth. Instead, it was the opinion that was viewed as the most correct by the common people. That was why politicians who were supported by the common people would instead be controlled by the common people. No matter how skilled a politician was, the longer they held power, the better they would be at following the crowd. What results they would be able to achieve in the end wouldn't actually depend on their personal abilities or abilities. Instead, it would depend on whether or not the god of luck was on their side. Whether a politician was good or bad could only be seen after a few years or decade. When his successor and his successor's successor did not do a good job, people would think of their predecessors. They would curse these shitty days, and reminisce about the past with their old friends in a drunken stupor. With worse days and a foolish new leader as a comparison, people would feel that life was getting more and more difficult. Only then would people discover, to their astonishment, that the original leader had actually done a good job. That foolish old man who had made so many mistakes in the past had actually done a good job in the past. Now, looking back, the seeds that he had planted back then had already sprouted. Those seemingly foolish methods had actually benefited the common people many years later. Meanwhile, his successor's seemingly beautiful plans and grand goals were still just plans and goals hundreds of years later. Apart from politicians and politicians, there was another type of person. Even they themselves didn't know why they became leaders. Their motivation for climbing up wasn't even for themselves. Our country is about to be destroyed. The common people have no way of making a living. I'm definitely going to expel the foreign enemies and return our land to us. If this continues, our living space will become smaller and smaller. This won't do. We have to work hard for the sake of our nation's rise. We have to learn from the foreign species' strong points. Most people who thought too much or didn't have enough abilities died on the way. However, there were always some people who were talented and had ideals that others thought were laughable, childish, and impossible to realize. In the end, they persevered and reached the peak as if they were blessed by the god. They accomplished things that others would never even dare to imagine in their entire lives. Such people were able to leave traces in history. More accurately speaking, they created history. They themselves were a part of history. If one had to find a name for them, perhaps historical figures would be the most appropriate description. But on the other hand, the trajectory of their own destiny was the exact opposite. Politicians always earned the most. The other side of their lack of opinions was that anyone could pay a price to make them speak. They always chose the winner. Before they completely lost, they would always stand at the top of the entire society and enjoy endless glory and wealth. Their strengths and weaknesses could be seen by the people of the current generation. The winner of the endless power struggle was naturally the winner. The fate of politicians was different, but the more they did, the more mistakes they made. Their glory and criticism were endless. The final result might be good or bad, but when it was necessary, they would make their own choices, even if it would destroy their own future. Their achievements would be discovered by later generations. They would either be grateful or angry. At the very least, there would be traces left behind. Historical figures were even more extreme. They had invested a lot and paid a lot, but their benefits might not be as great. In fact, they often didn't even have a good ending. For example, Yu Fei, Jeanne d'Arc, Shang Yang, and so on. Their achievements were praiseworthy, but they often died before dawn. Perhaps their deaths themselves were tragedies to begin with. They would become history. They would become role models for future generations. They would also cause countless people to sigh. In fact, they would even become material for creators. The foundational difference between a historical figure and a historical figure and a historical figure was that the historical figure of a historical figure would never be forgotten by others before the history of that particular person or race was destroyed. The He continent was quite cruel. It was cruel to the point where centralized political power became the mainstream. It was cruel to the point where the efficiency brought about by power was superior to everything else. Politicians were usually limited to a few specific countries. Heroes were born in troubled times. Many years of war had given rise to countless heroes. However, there weren't many who were truly able to leave behind traces in history. And the commonality of these people was that they had all forgotten about themselves for the sake of a certain goal. As I looked at Kierkegaard's background, I thought of all the people I knew in the past. Ale, Asso, Orlas, Estrada, and so on. All of them had different standpoints, and they all had conflicting interests. However, there were some things that were similar. Perhaps they would no longer exist, but their ideals and achievements would still remain in this world. They would influence the future of this world. And this old fox who saw through everything but chose to give up seemed to have used his own method to change the future. Kierkegaard had just been talking about his own political views. Yet, in the blink of an eye, he had transformed into a mundane businessman. He didn't feel any unease at all as he completely focused on his new job. This made me feel like I had underestimated Kierkegaard even more. Of course you underestimated him. He easily tricked you. Didn't you want to make trouble for him for secretly selling military resources? He only said a few sentences, and you've already forgotten? Harlowe's words surprised me. Indeed, no matter what the reason was, secretly selling military resources was definitely wrong. The Mist Alliance's resources were meant for you to prepare for war. Even if you couldn't use them, shouldn't you return them to the Mist Alliance's military? What was the meaning of secretly selling military resources? If everyone learned from you, what would happen to military discipline? Forget it. It's a matter for the Mist Alliance's military. Why should I interfere? However, I didn't really care anymore as I looked at how enthusiastic the Elven Elves were. Some people used their foolish actions to make the World Blade underestimate them. Some people were able to use propaganda and the protection of their ancestors to make others unknowingly overestimate their intelligence and lower limit. From a certain standpoint, after losing their only emperor, the Elven Kingdom, which had a clan system and an elder system, produced more and more sly and cunning politicians. In fact, even the increasingly popular council system was an invention of the elves. From a certain standpoint, the Elven Elves needed public opinion and the support of prestige. Not only did the Elven Elves need to be controlled by the Council of Elders, they also needed to be controlled by the Elven Elves. Royal authority was constantly being restricted. If the Emperor wanted to do anything, he would first have to obtain the support of the Elven Elves. This indeed met my standards for a politician. I wouldn't say that politicians were naturally short-sighted or something like that. However, the Elven Elders would always keep me at a lower limit and challenge my logic. Those elves are connected to the Holy Church? They were even the ones who proposed the Divine Alliance plan to restrict the Mist Alliance? I held the secret letter signed by Swana in my hand. The sharp-eared messenger in front of me was trembling as a mysterious chill froze the ground of my tent. The chilly wind was only a sign of anger. It wasn't that I doubted the veracity of Swana's information. It was just that I was truly unable to evaluate the Moon Elves' lower limit. Originally, I had only thought that the Northland's Moon Elves would desire to break free from the Mist Alliance's control and become independent. I never expected that they would directly collude with the enemy. However, logically speaking, this was indeed a possibility. It was nothing more than an extension of the Northland's foreign policy of befriending the distant and attacking the nearby. Since the Moon Elves wanted to break free from the Mist Alliance's control, and since the Elven gods couldn't be counted on, it seemed only natural that they would join the Holy Church, the strongest faction in the mortal plane. Once the Divine Alliance that would restrict the Mist Alliance was established, the Mist Alliance would naturally have to focus on dealing with the troubles in the south. This would also reduce the pressure on the Moon Elves. They have another plan. The middle-aged elf messenger seemed rather hesitant. It would seem that the Moon Elves were worried that the letter would be intercepted and written into the tent, so they used a messenger to directly deliver the message. I snapped my fingers, causing the silly cat to cast an anti-detection spell on the tent. I then walked up to the messenger. The messenger looked left and right, his eyes filled with unease. However, I became even more interested in the information he was delivering. What was it that made it so difficult for him to even say it? They're preparing to assassinate Empress Harloise. They've even sent out assassins. Apart from that, I paused in surprise upon hearing this, but then I felt that it was rather funny. Harloise was now my magical pet. She wouldn't die unless I died. What meaning would there be in assassinating her? However, the messenger didn't finish speaking. He had a panicked expression as he looked behind me and shouted loudly. "They're also intending to assassinate you." I suddenly turned around. I had already unsheathed my longsword, but there was no one behind me. There was only the bright moonlight illuminating the empty ground. However, the next instant I mysteriously felt a chill run down my spine. Under the gaze of the moonlight, the messenger, who looked simple and honest, suddenly rushed forward. The blue dagger was filled with fatal poison. So, he was the assassin. Chapter 685. Although I didn't have any experience in the path of an assassin, nor did I have any talent in this area, I had learned some common knowledge about assassins since I had been assassinated far too many times. Newbie assassins could only patiently wait for an opportunity. If an opportunity never came, and they didn't want to risk their lives, they could only leave in defeat. Veteran assassins looked down on such waiting behavior. They would actively create opportunities to attack. This was the foundational difference between a newbie assassin and a veteran assassin. Using words and actions to distract the assassin's attention and assassinate when the assassin revealed an opening was a foundational skill for a high-level assassin. Stronger assassins would have many tricks up their sleeves to increase the power of their interference, such as using illusory sounds to create sound sources, hypnosis, hints to make their words more deceptive, and disguise their identities. All of these were just for the sake of capturing the opponent's attention for a short period of time. The top-level assassins would return to their original state and wait for an opportunity. However, they had enough patience. If one day wasn't enough, they would wait for 100 days. If 1 year wasn't enough, they would wait for 10 years. One day, they would find an opening. An assassin could become your servant, your friend's friend, your customer. They could use several years to get close to you, several decades to obtain your trust, and several decades to wait for an opportunity to kill you. Even I would be wary of such a suicidal assassin, but now the elven assassin's handsome face was filled with vicious veins. His slender elven body suddenly thickened, as if he had used some forbidden technique that drained his life force. His dagger was incredibly sharp, and the poison on it was obviously no ordinary item. However, I laughed. A dagger that contained poison? A top-level assassin? That's it? You're looking down on me so much? I silently muttered the word dragon in my mind, and the next instant, my entire body was covered in dragon-scale armor. This way, any ordinary legend-ranked weapon would have difficulty breaking through my defense. You didn't even do your homework, and you want to kill me? On the way back, I met with many assassins. The most dangerous one was indeed the one who broke through Harlow's defenses. However, the advantage of my choice to create armor back in the day was now evident. Against this guardian of Yongya, which had evolved to the semi-god equipment level, I was easily able to survive until reinforcements arrived. Of course, the disadvantage was that I revealed a trump card that had already been revealed multiple times. Something's wrong. When I thought about how my ability to instantly summon heavy armor had already been exposed, I instinctively felt that something was wrong. Even though I shouldn't be injured if I were to take that dagger head-on, I still chose to retreat while drawing my sword to block. Bang! The sound of the sword and dagger clashing against each other was like the sound of a train colliding. I had already recovered a lot of my stamina. Even if my current strength wasn't on par with an immemorial dragon's, I should still be much stronger than a giant's. However, the result was that I felt a sharp pain between my thumb and index finger, as if I had been hit by a battering ram. The terrifying brute force made me lose my balance. I stomped hard on the ground, sending gravel and sand flying. It took me quite a while to regain my balance. The enchanted adamantine longsword that I had gotten from Dong Lan had been smashed into smithereens. That was a high-quality military weapon that was worth at least 300 gold coins. Yet, my opponent's weapon only had a slight crack. No, it wasn't a crack. It was merely a layer of camouflage paint that had fallen off. The broken part was a transparent green jade, and I only knew of one top-notch dagger of this color. Emerald tooth? Right when I noticed that something was wrong with the situation, that concept of destruction filled with violence and hatred was already right in front of me. Only when I recognized the assassin did I feel even more troubled. That harmless-looking face was completely twisted, and it was completely different from the person in his memories. However, this jade dagger was far too famous. Jade Flame, Sire had become famous around 700 years ago. He was a level 4 semi-god with a concept weapon called Emerald Tooth. Although he only used a dagger, he was one of the most famous legend-ranked warriors in all of I. Sire was one of the kingdom's guardians in the Rivendauer Elven territory. However, that Elven territory had been destroyed during the Yongya calamity, and Sire himself had disappeared in the chaos of war. Some people said that he had died, while others said that he had become a mercenary who only cared about money. But now I was certain that Sire had always been hiding in the shadows, waiting for a chance to take revenge. Revenge. The Elven language of revenge echoed throughout this entire space. A powerful sense of dizziness robbed me of my stamina. The first to be injured was actually the semi-god assassin. His eyes suddenly exploded, and 2 empty holes appeared where his flesh and blood exploded, and black tears of blood flowed out. The blood tears mixed together with the twisted power of the spell and poured into the jade dagger. The blood didn't dye the dagger black, but it made it seem even more crystalline and green. This wasn't some evil sacrifice. This was simply an Elven Ranger's determination to take revenge. The Elven Ranger who believed in revenge as his concept was eternally sacrificing his vision and lifespan. His weapon was eternally locked onto his enemy. Damn it! At this moment, I had already retracted all thoughts of toying with my enemy and focused all of my attention on surviving. As a concept, revenge was most suitable for the warrior job class. This was especially true for shield warriors who specialized in defense. When revenge was used as a concept, it would actually be a type of counterattack. A hunter who specialized in the power of revenge would be able to lock onto a mortal enemy. Just by targeting the target, his weapon of revenge would receive a tremendous damage bonus. This damage bonus would infinitely increase based on the target's aggro and the damage the hunter received. As for Jade Tooth, this famous weapon of revenge was also the most famous double-edged sword. Once the hunter locked onto a target, if the hunter couldn't kill the target within a month, tremendous pain and misfortune would befall the hunter. This pain would also increase the power of the weapon of revenge, as well as urge the hunter to take revenge as quickly as possible. This pain would double every month. After a year, the weapon of revenge would be able to cause the hunter to die a painful death. The hunter could also give up on the target he had locked onto, but the price would be a permanent decrease in power level. But after the weapon of revenge locked onto a target, it would no longer be able to harm anyone else. Otherwise, it would be unrelated to revenge, which would mean that the concept of revenge would collapse. The prerequisites for the power of revenge to lock onto an enemy would be hatred and the reality of being injured. It was impossible for me to harm the hunter right now, which meant that he had locked onto my soul ever since I was still young. This dagger, which should have been transparent, was actually as green as jade. This was the result of over 100 years of accumulated hatred. This lunatic had actually endured endless, life-threatening pain for over 100 years, and this dagger's attack power against Yonya had multiplied over and over again for over 100 years. Sire, you're crazy. It's been over 100 years, and you're still locking on to me. Sire didn't reply. His two empty eyes were still staring at me, but the corners of his mouth curled up into a smile. It was a tacit agreement, a complacency, and a resolution. Insane, completely insane. In front of the power of vengeance that had been accumulated for countless years, a chill ran down my spine from the bottom of my feet. At this moment, I no longer had the confidence to block this dagger of vengeance with my semi-god armor. The dagger wasn't fast, but as I stared at its fragile blade, I felt like I would be unable to dodge it. Sire's desire for revenge had already locked onto the existence known as Yonya. As a top-level warrior, fighting was already an instinct. The closer one was to death, the faster one's reactions would become, and the clearer one's thoughts would become. In this desperate situation, I thought of an idea. Explode. A simple word in the dragon language caused my precious dragon-scale armor to completely explode. This armor, which was strong enough to block god equipment, was shattered into pieces just like that. The flying pieces not only viciously bombarded Sire, who had lost both his eyes, my aura also filled the entire area with the armor's shards, disrupting Sire's senses as he lacked the ability to see. As expected, Sire's expression became blank for a short moment, and the dagger in his hand also stopped moving. This dragon-scale armor was a part of my physical body to begin with. The moment it shattered, Sire could sense that Yonya had shattered everywhere, so it was only natural that he would stop moving. The next second, his empty eyes glared in my direction. Revenge. Sire said the exact same words. I was once again forcefully stopped by an invisible force as the dagger slowly and gently pushed towards me. This attack was almost a fatal one. However, this 1 second was enough for me to use another ultimate defensive weapon. It's you, Cat Shield. I picked up the black cat and forcefully blocked the dagger. Harlois then screamed in my ears and in the depths of my soul. Roland! You damned bastard! Sire remained unmoved as he viciously stabbed his dagger into Sire's body. And then, Jade Tooth stopped moving. Sire's user had an expression of disbelief as he collapsed and fainted. I sat down on the ground and panted heavily. This time, I had truly escaped with my life. Meanwhile, the silly cat discovered to her astonishment that the dagger stabbed into her chest didn't hurt at all. She then curiously took it out, tilted her head, and thought about it for a moment before coming to an understanding. This Jade Tooth had locked onto Roland's soul. After Cyrus sacrificed both of his eyes, this jade tooth had permanently locked onto Roland's soul. And Roland's magical pet also contained a shard of Roland's soul. Since Roland was acting as a meat shield, Cyrus would naturally prioritize attacking Roland's magical pet. However, Harloise was still an independent individual. Attacking an unrelated person like her would mean that Cyrus was taking revenge on the wrong person. Naturally, the concept of revenge would be shattered, and Cyrus would be unable to harm Harloise. Yep, using a magical pet as a meat shield was a method that I had come up with back in the day to deal with the Elven Ranger's power of revenge. It would seem that this method that only existed in theory really worked in reality. However, it was also fortunate that Cyrus had sacrificed his vision in order to kill Cyrus. Otherwise, this dagger wouldn't have stabbed the wrong person. These things weren't difficult to understand. The silly cat just hadn't understood them at the time. Now that she understood, I said angrily as I watched Harloise play with the dagger in her chest. Why did you only wake up now? You're a bodyguard. Be careful that I don't deduct your salary. Upon hearing this, the silly cat's expression suddenly changed as if she suddenly remembered something. Right, I forgot that I had something to talk to you about. Just now I was also assassinated. My clone was killed in front of everyone, and now it exploded into a slime. How am I supposed to explain this? What? Chapter 686. Elven Empress Harloise and who were assassinated at the same time. The assassins, Jade Flame, Cyrus and Akaba's Wing Ven, died on the spot, while Iron Emperor Sarvan escaped with heavy injuries. The Mist Kingdom has put out a warrant for his arrest. A new day hadn't even arrived yet, but a shocking piece of news had already shocked the entire Northlands. Before dawn, after I reported to Renée and the others that I was safe, we began to organize the details of this assassination attempt. For an old fox like me who had walked far too far down the path of the soul, lying to my face would be meaningless. It would only make me suspicious and vigilant. In order to attract my attention and gain my trust, Cyrus, who had disguised himself as a messenger, told me nothing but the truth. Not only had Harloise been assassinated, the assassins had been two top-level elven semigods. Accompanied by other superior elves, they had successfully assassinated the new elven empress Harloise clone. A semigod elven archer, and a transformed Drool who was skilled at binding and magic resistance. Both are natural enemies of all mages. My clone was instantly destroyed and turned into a pile of slime mud. How am I supposed to explain this to them? Harloise was rather frustrated. It was no wonder that she reacted so slowly. She must have been focusing all of her attention on her clone's work, and her own assassination attempt had absorbed all of her attention. By the time she returned to my side, the assassination attempt had probably ended, and she came to discuss it with me. Both assassinations had occurred at the same time. It was obvious that the assassins had sent 3 veteran semigods to deal with me at once in order to attract my attention and distract my reinforcements. At this moment, Harloise was still worrying about how she had exposed her slime clone. That probably wasn't important at all. If my clone exploded, I'll just say that it was a ninja magic technique from the East called Shadow Clone. It split into a slime in the end? Shadow Clone? That's ridiculous. Just say that it was a water clone, a water clone. What kind of explanation is that? Isn't it enough that you're still alive and kicking? At most, you can just show off your clone abilities. I felt that Harloise's worries were unnecessary. As long as she was capable of keeping things under control, there wouldn't even be a need for an explanation. If she couldn't keep things under control, any explanation would be meaningless. Moreover, with her identity, it was normal for her to have a few life-saving abilities. Explain? Do I need to explain my life-saving trump card to you? Are you trying to murder me? This sudden incident gave us many things to think about. The newly appointed elf empress had been assassinated by an elf. Harloise had many feelings about this. Wasn't this done by the Moon Elves? Harloise held it in for a long time before she managed to squeeze out this sentence. Although it was a question, it was a definite tone. Nonsense, if those elves had the ability, they would have long since overturned the heavens. Just because the assassins were powerful elves didn't mean that the assassins were truly the work of elves. The more they acted like assassins from the kingdom of the elves, the more I felt that there was someone behind them. I didn't even need to guess who the mastermind was. The Holy Church. It's definitely him. Only they have this kind of foundation. The Holy Church was the largest faction in the human world. Humans were the main faction, but there were also many powerful individuals from various species who were loyal to the Holy Light faction. Finding a few elven sacrificial warriors wouldn't be a problem for them. However, the Moon Elves are also involved. Perhaps even some human domain lords were tricked by you. Most likely. Let's wait for the investigation result. We felt rather helpless. Even though we clearly knew who wanted to kill us, it was difficult to even take revenge. This was indeed quite depressing. Syrer is an excellent chess piece. Not only that, he's an incredibly valuable chess piece. There was no such thing as the strongest or invincible in this world. Every ability had its own advantages and disadvantages. The power of vengeance was an ancient and powerful power. It was said that it originated from the great demons hunting witchcraft. Many elven rangers still practiced this secret art, and there were even special advanced job classes. However, very few people actually practiced the power of vengeance. Although this special ability would allow the weak to defeat the strong, it was far too infrequent. It was usually reserved for unlucky individuals whose lives were just like the protagonists of a tragic story. Every month of vengeance passed, the power of a vengeance weapon would increase, and a cultivator's pain of heart would also multiply. However, there was a limit to the weapon's material, and there was also a limit to a person's endurance. Naturally, there would also be a limit to how powerful the power of vengeance could be. Logically speaking, Syrer should have long since reached this limit since he hadn't stopped using vengeance for more than 100 years. Syrer had forcefully killed himself, yet he was still alive. His hatred for me was as if it had just happened yesterday. Keeping him alive and using him as a good chess piece is truly. I lowered my body and suddenly swung my jade dagger down, causing blood to fly everywhere. Syrer's dagger had taken his master's life. I was no saint, nor did I have the habit of raising a tiger that would bring me trouble. You want to kill me for vengeance? I was more than happy to try, but be mentally prepared to die in battle if you failed. Although I really wanted to know what had happened, I didn't intend to hand Syrer over to the interrogators. Physical torture would be nothing more than a tickle to a powerful individual who could withstand the power of vengeance. Unfortunately, after Syrer's death, Syrer's myth-ranked weapon, Jade Tooth, had lost its glow and turned into white jade. It was obvious that it had dropped in power level. I could faintly sense that this dagger was changing. Just as I was carefully playing with it, Harloise glanced at Syrer's corpse, seemingly eager to try it. Soul search. No, that's too much of a waste. Soul searching wasn't omnipotent. The more resolute a soul was, the more difficult it would be to analyze. There was no doubt about Syrer's willpower, but since I was the one casting the spell, Syrer's hostility would be far too strong. In that case, rather than wasting Syrer's precious corpse by taking out some mostly useless memory fragments, I might as well make good use of it. Perhaps I could even have Syrer personally tell me who the mastermind behind all this was. I directly tossed Syrer's corpse into my personal bug-like world as I began to consider how Syrer had managed to survive until today. After all, Yonye had destroyed far too many people in the kingdom of the elves back in the day, and the power of vengeance was no secret among the elves. It would be quite amusing if two more mortal enemies appeared. The simplest method would probably be to separate the soul from the physical body and freeze it in cold storage, and then awaken it when it's time to use it. That way, you can assassinate your mortal enemy before the blood moon of vengeance rises in the sky to avoid dying from pain. Right, you can also use holy light divine arts to forcefully prolong your life. High-density holy light is just as effective as illegal drugs to make people forget pain. As I thought up to this point, I felt even more certain that the Holy Church had something to do with Cyrus' death. They had worked so hard to maintain a dagger that could only be used to assassinate Yongye, not to mention that Yongye had already disappeared. Only the incredibly wealthy Holy Church would be able to do something like this. However, I was absolutely certain that the Holy Church had forgotten about the frozen dagger and only remembered to use it at the last minute. Roland, look at the dagger. Upon hearing this, I discovered that the jade dagger at my waist had already shrunk by 1/3 of its original size, and I was actually faintly feeling pain where the dagger touched my waist. I pulled out the dagger and carefully inspected its blade. Not only was there a crack on the blade that was stained with its owner's blood, but it was also dyed in an abnormal dark red color. Just looking at this abnormal dark red color made me instinctively feel uneasy, as if there was an assassin watching me from the shadows. 5 fate points. I'll help you appraise the dagger. It's that good? My system actually volunteered to help me? This was truly a rare sight. I unhesitatingly agreed. 5 fate points was basically negligible. Dagger of Vengeance. Yongye's Armageddon, Semigod equipment. This dagger was once the jade tooth of the legendary warrior Syrar. Not only did Syrar die to his mortal enemy, his beloved dagger was also stabbed into his own throat. In the final moments of his life, Syrar's soul attached itself to his own blood and sacrificed all of his power of vengeance to curse this dagger, creating this legendary level weapon. Unique characteristic: enemy of Yongye, the wielder of this dagger will instinctively loathe the undead, and will view all undead emperors as mortal enemies. Any undead that is hit by this dagger will have a certain chance of being instantly annihilated. Due to the curse of the previous wielder, the wielder of this dagger will have nightmares of being destroyed by an undead calamity every night. The wielder will also subconsciously hate the undead emperors named Yongye. And if this dagger hits the physical body of an undead emperor named Yongye, it will instantly destroy the enemy's defenses and destroy the target's soul. P.S. Excellent job. This is a guillotine that you personally created for yourself. You can use it when you want to commit seppuku. You'll definitely die a quick and easy death. I finally understood why my system was being so kind as I looked at this comment that was filled with evil intentions. It was obvious that my system was watching me make a fool of myself. I could only helplessly shake my head. Although it was quite rare for this dagger to mysteriously be strengthened so much, and it was already a miracle that it had been upgraded to semi-god equipment, if this miracle had been directed at me personally, I definitely wouldn't have kept it. As I held the dagger, I really did intend to destroy it. However, an idea suddenly popped into my mind, and I changed my mind. Perhaps as long as I used this dagger correctly, it would still be useful, very useful. As for myself, actually, I haven't been an undead for many years, and my name isn't Yongye, is it?